Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. On today's episode, we have the second part of Althusser's Contradiction and Overdetermination with Matthew Furlong. This is, I think, the concluding episode of our overall Dialectic Deep Dive series, where, of course, we're going to keep working with Matthew. We have a whole thing planned about Marx's dissertation on ancient philosophy and Bellamy Foster's work around eco-socialism, etc. So we have a lot more coming, but this is probably the last installment of the Dialectics Deep Dive series proper. So, if this is the first time you're hearing of it, we have 3 years plus of material in this series. I'm very proud of it, very happy with it, and this is a great way to bring this series to its culmination. So couldn't ask for a better guest than Matthew to do these sorts of episodes with. And I also wanted to plug the fact that we have an ongoing agreement with our friends over at leftwingbooks.net, associated with Kershblevlade Publishing House, to allow Rev Left listeners to get 15% off any book in their store. And they have a broad range of books, from theory and history to anything you could want on the revolutionary left. There's a book in their library that you can purchase and learn from. And wonderfully, because our projects are so similar in our goals between Rev Left and Left Wing Books, that we've come together and tried to give people an option to access those books at an even more affordable rate. So I will link to that in the show notes, and the link you'll hit will already have the checkout code RevLeft embedded within it. So you just click that link, find your book, 15% off right away. It's a great way to make important works of theory and history more accessible to more people, especially in these challenging economic times, which I know all of us are feeling deeply. All right, without further ado, here's me and Matthew's discussion on the second part of Althusser's Contradiction and Overdetermination, but we touch on so much more, okay? We touch on the Holocaust. We touch on great man of theory history. We touch on Althusser's distinction between base and superstructure, and his criticism of Engels in a letter in which Engels was trying to articulate some basic elements of Marxism, and we get into incredibly deep conversations about the crisis racking in American imperialism, U.S. hegemony around the world, the campus uprisings and the encampments popping up not only all across the U.S. but now across the world, the ruling elite's attempt to squash those, and how it betrays every lie of liberal ideology about free speech, about democracy, about freedom. We get into a bunch of stuff. So while the title says Althusser's Contradiction and Overdetermination, the substance of this conversation goes well beyond the confines of just that paper, as all of these Dialectic Deep Dive episodes do. So even if you have no idea about what this essay is about, you have no idea about even Althusser, you will find plenty in this conversation to enjoy and hopefully stimulate your thinking. All right, everybody, we are back for part 2 of our Dialectics Deep Dive episode on Althusser's Contradiction and Overdetermination. Part 1 of this conversation came out in February. Our schedule's kind of been crazy on both ends. We've tried to make this happen quicker, but it's happening now, so that's fine. Of course, we have back on the show the person who is with me on all our Dialectic Deep Dive episodes, which is our good friend of the show, friend of mine, Matthew Furlong. So, Matthew, for the few people out there who might not know who you are, can you introduce yourself? Maybe give just a very quick sort of recap of part 1 so people can orient themselves to what we're talking about. And then I also know that you wanted to address a question or concern that a listener had. So maybe you can do that all up front.
Yeah, okay. So as Breht told you, my name is Matthew. And we have... on April 21st, I think, was the 3rd anniversary of our first Dialectics Deep Dive coming out. So it's been over 3 years now that I've been appearing on the show, and just working on a sort of sustained inquiry into, I guess, the history and structures and practices of dialectics. And this episode, which is Dialectics Deep Dive 6 Part 2, will be the end of the project that I set out 3 years ago, which was to provide a companion to Torkel Lauessen's discussion about the principal contradiction, and get into the sort of nitty-gritty of dialectics down at the level of how we perceive and think and act. Because, as Lenin says, dialectics is not just a law of what we think of as external nature; it's also a law of cognition. And with this episode, I think we're coming full circle because the essay Contradiction and Overdetermination by Althusser, which we discussed last time and we'll conclude discussing this time, was sort of very much lurking in the background for me in preparation for doing this sort of 3-year project that we've done. And so I think we've pretty much, I think, satisfactorily done this exploration, which I think is in many ways an exploration considering considering that the contours and outlines of a Marxist philosophy of mind, I would say. I don't know if you would, do you think that's a fair characterization in a way, Breht?
Yeah, an interesting one, but I think a fair one for sure.
Yeah, and so what I think we're going to do for, I've suggested this to Breht for the next phase. It's like Marvel phase 5, 6, whatever they got. So this is Dialectics Deep Dive phase 2. Is we're going to get to the episode about Karl Marx's doctoral dissertation on the atomistic systems of Democritus and Epicurus, and go into a deep dive series about a philosophy of nature and to address ecology and eco-socialism, various topics sort of that intersect with that. So I'm interested, for example, in looking at this a scientific discipline called biogeochemistry, which I find very interesting, and to look at the work of John Bellamy Foster, who writes about eco-socialism. So he wrote Marx's Ecology, was his first book, and he draws on Marx's dissertation to mount that argument. So I think that's where we're going to go next. But in any event, this is the last episode of the deep dives as we have known it. And what would I also go ahead?
Do you think we'll come up with a new series name so we can leave this one as it is and then move on to a new series name?
Yeah, we could do that. That might be fresh because you can only say that so many dialectics deep dive so many times before it stops making sense when you say any word too many times. Last time we touched on. We dug into this. We dove deeply into this essay, Contradiction and Overdetermination, which is, I think, really good for getting us to think about how things move and change historically in ways that sort of confound our expectations of them. So why Althusser spent some time talking about, the Western the Marxists of Western Europe were shocked that the revolution kicked off in backwards Russia rather than, regal, august Germany or something like that. So, and I often think of at the end of Blowback season 2, either Brendan James or Noah Cullen, one of the two hosts, reads a letter or an account that Fidel Castro wrote about the whole Cuban Revolution after it all happened. And he said, looking back on it, I'm paraphrasing here, with all the crazy twists and turns and weird, unexpected things that happened, who could have imagined it still ended up with the outcome that we had? Because when you really dig into history and get down to a granular level in analyzing it, and I'm sure, Breht, you're learning more and more and more about this all the time with your present studies, it doesn't at all map the kind of map onto this idea of history as like a royal road. That the worst sorts of Hegelian influenced people make it out to be, like, again, Francis Fukuyama, the nadir of this form, and the nadir and the acme at the same time of this form of thinking. And so Althusser does a good job in this essay of helping us stay honest about how history actually transpires and moves, and to not get caught up in sort of idealistic schemes that we then apply onto reality, and which force us to leave most of reality on the cutting room floor in order to make it fit our scheme, so to speak. So this episode, we're just going to clue up our consideration of this essay, and I guess clue up the deep dives, and then see what's coming next. And I did have, I had some housekeeping in respect of a listener question. So this was from Ian back in February, and I found this an interesting line of questioning because I have seen it many, many times over the years, and it's good because it's something that a lot of people can easily fall into because of the way that we are educated, in the way that Western thinking is structured or tends to be structured. So he says, basically says, and he's in respect of the example that we used from Gray and Priest about when does one state change into another state? What is the instant of that transformation? In the instant of the transformation from one state to another state, he's giving the example of a pen, moving along a piece of paper as someone is writing and then lifting off as they're done writing. And the question is, in that instant, when the pen leaves the paper, is it neither on nor off the paper? Is it on and not off the paper? Is it not on and off the paper, or is it both on and off the paper? And Ian said, in response to this, I can't say I agree with tossing out the principle of non-contradiction, which is to say that it on some level offends thought to consider that the pen may be both on and off the paper at the same time, according to this this thought experiment that Gray and Priest lays out, that anyone is interested in, you can go back to the last episode and listen to it. And I think, and Ian offered a number of responses, but I think the whole thing can really be summed up by just responding to the first statement, which is, I can't say I really agree with tossing out the principle of non-contradiction. And the answer is that nobody suggested that at any point. Neither Breht nor I suggested that. I don't believe that Gray and Priest suggested that. And it doesn't need to be that at all. And it's just interesting because over the years, I've found that whenever you enter into a discussion about dialectical concepts or process concepts, like you find in Alfred North Whitehead or Deleuze or somebody like that, you frequently see this reaction that's saying that, to the effect that, oh, well, you're negating and annihilating and throwing away the logic of non-contradiction, which makes sense in many everyday circumstances. So, like, if you're trying to cross a crosswalk, it's very, very helpful to know that walk and do, or cross and don't cross, are mutually exclusive states. And if you mess that up and think, well, in a certain way, they're kind of really both, because one changes into the other, you may get totally smoked by a car as you're being a philosophical genius. Or for, what's the other one? Oh, I had a number of other things, but just like, there is no reason at all for anyone to think that adopting or accepting, entertaining this kind of dialectical logic entails throwing out the sort of classical logic of non-contradictory, mutually exclusive states that cannot sort of obtain at the same time. Mm-hmm. And I would say that just in response to that, my position is more that these two kinds of logic sort of like complement one another, because they both pertain to different aspects of reality and are valid within their sort of sphere of applicability. And in this end, I think someone discussing this with Ian on the comments said, it's the same thing as, the introduction of quantum concepts and quantum rules does not negate or annihilate the classical concepts and the classical rules of physics.
That's
right?
Good. Yeah, I like that.
That was a really good one. Likewise, the establishment or the discovery of the real numbers does not annihilate or negate the reality of the integers, for example. And in fact, you can't, like, if you were to get rid of the real numbers because the logic of the real numbers appears to contradict in a total way the logic of the integers, you wouldn't really be able to do any kind of science anymore. But just in general, I think that the way that I look at it is that in actually existing, for whatever reasons this happens to be the case, there seem to be aspects of reality to which state concepts apply very readily and can actually help us do things. But then there are also these kinds of concepts of continuum or continua, if I could put it that way. And we are forced by experience and practice to deal with those things in order to like get around the world as well. In fact, we require both of these logics in order for things to work, in order for us to actually do anything and think anything and accomplish anything. And And it's, it's very much like, it really mirrors sort of the logic of like wave particle duality, if I want to put it that way. Or if you want to put, or anyone wants to put it that way. So I just wanted to say, but I've noticed that in especially through the structures of academia, people become very uncomfortable because when you introduce these kinds of, continuum logics or dialectical logics, process logics, people seem to really assume right off the jump that you're asking them to throw out this sort of more everyday common sense about, black can't be white, up can't be down, all this kind of stuff. And I think that, this is why we looked at Spinoza, because Spinoza gives you a sort of a method for moving back and forth between these two sort of registers of logic without it being a problem. So I don't know if any of that is helpful to you, Ian. But I think, the important thing is that although I can understand why it might seem like that's where we were going with it, in dialectical materialism, we don't just chop off and throw out sort of older forms of thinking. We try to accommodate different forms within our method, I guess.
Include and transcend, continuity and rupture, taking what's useful in things and then carrying those elements forward. For people who might be a little lost here, because, this is sort of, logic and philosophy, and some people aren't totally caught up on this, it's just worth defining very quickly and very simply the law of non-contradiction. For some, it may be obvious, but in like logic, the law of non-contradiction states that contradictory propositions cannot both be true in the same sense at the same time, e.g. the two propositions P is the case and P is not the case are mutually exclusive. And dialectics has this element, which is visualized in things like, the yin-yang symbol, wherein the opposite of the thing being asserted is in some form present in the thing itself. And so that kind of creates this tension, but this is, of course, not to say that the law of non-contradiction is completely tossed out as a valid logical form in many cases. It's just to sort of complicate that in some ways and take our thinking and our logical framework to a higher level, while, of course, including certain aspects of things that came before, like the law of non-contradiction. Is that a fair way of sort of summarizing that up?
Yeah, and Priest, in a number of places that I can't think of right now, discusses how you can introduce this sort of dialectical logic that he's talking about, and then on top of that, reconstruct all the categories of like quote unquote classical critical thinking without anything being fundamentally changed within that register. So it doesn't, when you sort of adjoin this dialectical logic to this sort of classical logic, one doesn't destroy the other. And that's sort of like a fantasy I have, is that someday I'm going to do a dialectical critical thinking primer where we start out with the dialectical layer and then move up to the stuff that you're used to every day and then show the transition from one to the other. Nice. So yeah, that's one of my minor like dreams.
That's awesome.
What I'd like to do someday.
Certainly.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I hope, anyway, and I hope that was helpful. But I would say that the habit of saying as soon as someone introduces this kind of thing, they're annihilating the more classical, very commonsensical and useful logic of non-contradiction. I find that very much in keeping with the way academia in the West works anyway, where it's kind of like you have to cleave to this or that sort of system of thought, or more narrowly, a person's system of thought, and that anything else that comes into the environment, the choice is to either adopt the new thing and reject what you already had, or reject the new thing and keep what you already had. And there's this very just kind of like binary way that we're taught to think about these things. But in dialectical materialism, that's not how things operate at all.
Right.
And it's because I think partly the ultimate answer, as Marx says, is always, well, what's going on in practice? Does practice force people to use both these kinds of logics? Well, apparently it does. So we need to just deal with it that way. So like Deleuze actually has something along these lines where he just says, stop trying to explain it. These are the two fundamental aspects of experience as we know them. And every time you try to reduce one to the other or come up with a third concept to house both of them, something bad happens and you end up with just, crazy politics, crazy shit happening. So just stop trying to explain it and go with this duality and understand that they are nonetheless one, right? So it's the unity of opposites.
Absolutely.
And Buddhism is what leads you to this kind of insight, for example.
Absolutely. And the unity of opposites, in the most simplest terms, you can think of the concepts of, like, I don't know, anything, any binary, day and night. You know, does the concept day even make sense in lieu of the concept of night? They're mutually reinforcing concepts. But of course, when it is daytime, it is not nighttime, right? That's also true. But they're contained within one another at the same time. And so I think that's a sort of key to understanding this at, of course, a very simple level, but I think a helpful one for anybody kind of wrestling with this or finding any of this difficult.
And life and death, obviously, that's a big one.
A great one. That's a great one. And in fact, life and death is such a good one. Allison and I recently did an episode on AI and the Silicon Valley attempt to transcend death and create God. And we brought that point up, that an attempt to escape death is a disdain for life. What they think they're doing is they're trying to obliterate one side of the binary. Through all of our technology, we can escape death and live forever. But the moment you take death out of the table, life itself becomes meaningless, becomes a concept that it just makes absolutely no sense. And so really hidden within this hatred of death is a sort of hatred of life itself. And that's a dialectical way of apprehending what these people are sort of thinking of in terms of, you know, dualities and binaries. We can chop off one side of this binary of this coincidence of opposites and get the fucking thing that we want while completely obliterating its opposite. And that in and of itself is a fool's errand, which is why it is utterly impossible. And we made that very clear in the episode. And it's sort of neurotic in its attempt, but the attempt itself necessarily will be futile ultimately.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like people thinking about death. You can't imagine death. And so they onto this void, one projects all sorts of things. People are afraid of death. They think, what's it going to be like to go to sleep and never wake up? And they imagine themselves being shut up in the dark forever and get bugged by it. But on the other hand, when you start thinking about what will it be like to go to sleep and never wake up, suddenly occurs to you that when you were born, you woke up without ever having gone to sleep. It's rather funny. And of course, if it happened once, it can happen again. And that begins to get you real puzzled about what you mean by you. But everybody feels he's I. Everybody has this sensation of being in the middle of everything. Turn around and see more or less equally in all directions. And you feel that you're in the center. Everybody feels in the center, just as much as I do. In fact, insects feel they're in the center. And I'm quite sure they feel that they're people. We don't, of course, don't bother to notice them in any great detail. And therefore, they all look the same, and therefore we say, well, they're not people. They're all alike. They're some sort of mechanism. Well, they look at us in just the same way, and they can't make any sense out of what we're doing. So we're some sort of funny mechanisms going around, so far as they're concerned. But so there's a lot of mystery hidden in this self that we have. Well, of course, you see, we're worried about it. We see the organism vanishes. We're always defending our personalities. And somebody accuses our personality of falling apart and say, now, you're not being consistent. Or you're not fulfilling what you said you would do. You're not playing the role you're supposed to play. Everybody feels that they're coming apart because they're not acting right, as on the stage. So we are constantly on the defensive. And also, we're a prey to anxiety. Anxiety is a trembling motion. To be or not to be, that is the question. Because the minute you know you're alive, and really become aware of being alive, you realize that you might also be dead. Because to be implies not to be. And not to be, although we don't really think about that, implies to be. So we're always wondering, now, if I do this, will I survive? Or would I better do that? We're never quite sure. Because you think when you get a really important decision, you've got to make it. You wonder, did I take everything into consideration? Did I make a sensible judgment? Well, you never know. Because in the best thought out plan, always chancy things occur. You don't know whether you're going to slip on a banana skin or whether you're going to get sick. It's all very unpredictable. And therefore, we tremble. Now, when it occurs to us, of course, it doesn't in the ordinary way, that there is no choice between to be and not to be. just as there's no choice between front and back. Space implies solid just as much as solid implies space. But conscious attention ignores that. It suffers from ignorance. We notice the figure and ignore the background. We notice the solid and ignore the space. We notice the relatively moving in smaller object, but we ignore the relatively stationary background. That's with consciousness, with noticing. And so you see, we don't notice that in order to be present, you must also be absent. Because life is an energy system. And energy is something that vibrates. And whatever vibrates goes on and off. If I sit next to a girl in the movies, and she attracts me, and I put my hand on her knee, and just leave it there, she will in due course cease to notice it. Because it's a constant stimulus. But if I gently stroke her or pat her on the knee, she will keep noticing it, because it goes on and off. Now, all energy systems go on and off. You can't know you're on unless you're off, too. So we get waking and sleeping, we get every kind of rhythm. And there are tiny rhythms that go dig, 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 dig so fast, like a beam of light, that you don't notice the spaces, because your retina doesn't react quickly enough. It reacts to the stimulus of the on, but before it can go off, there's a new on. See? So you get what appears to be a constant stimulus. The table appears to be hard. It's vibrating so fast I can't put my finger through it. Same way as an airplane propeller appears to be solid, or an electric fan. But it's all going on and off. Now, there are these very fast vibrations of on and off, and there are very slow ones, like life and death. Now you see it, now you don't. That's what the world is. But because of the focusing of conscious attention, which regards on as real and off as unreal, because you ignore it, regards solid as real and space as unreal, it's like trying to think of waves as a series of crests without any troughs. But a wave is a crest trough. On off. So off is as important as on. You can't have anything happening without both. And although they are explicitly different, on and off, they're implicitly one. We call it energy. So if these neglected and ignored features of the world came to our attention, or in some way could impinge upon our consciousness, we should feel very differently than we ordinarily do feel. How would you feel? Well, I can roughly describe it to you. It's a very odd feeling indeed, at first. You feel that what you are doing and what happens to you are the same. You can say of everything that happens to you, I'm doing it. And of everything that you are doing is that it happens to me. For example, when you're steering a car, are you pulling the wheel or pushing it? It's push-pull, isn't it? Both. Although the words push and pull are formally, logically opposed to each other. But that's what you're doing when you're steering. You're push-pulling. So in exactly the same way, when you are acting, what your environment does and what you do are the same process. So when you feel that, it's very odd. You feel as you walk up a hill, the hill is lifting you. That a lot of people go crazy with this because they suddenly say, well, I'm God. I'm doing everything. And if then they start to tell everybody that they're God, and people object and say, well, it's absolutely preposterous that you should say you're personally in charge of the whole universe, and therefore should be bowed down to and given divine honors, you must be mad. Or a person may take entirely the opposite point of view and say, I do nothing. I'm just a little puppet on the end of strings, and everything I do is controlled by something else. In other words, becomes a complete fatalist. What he doesn't see is that both points of view are right. But of course, this won't fit in with an idea of God, which is based on the ancient monarchies of the Near East. That is to say, it won't do with an idea of God conceived as the cosmic boss. The boss, the chief, that's a political image. And it just doesn't work too well for the Godhead. It leads to all sorts of trouble. And as I often say, for Americans, you'd believe, don't you, as American citizens, that a republic is the best form of government? How can you square that with thinking of heaven as a monarchy? If heaven is a monarchy, monarchy is the best form of government. What about democracy in the kingdom of heaven? How about that now? So, you have to conceive God in accordance with some different kind of image. Or maybe, wait a moment, maybe we shouldn't do that at all. Images of God are idolatry, aren't they? There are no image. Because every image is an idol, and idols that are made of imagination and thought are much more dangerous than idols made of wood or stone. Nobody takes a wooden idol seriously. You merely regard it as a symbol, and it's such an obvious symbol. But a concept, that seems so spiritual, so abstract. But it's the most dangerous kind of idol, as we shall see when we come to the study of Buddhism, how it gets rid of all the conceptual idols.
All right. Well, that's a great intro to this conversation. So you want to get into the first question here?
Yes.
Okay. Now, to be fair, especially with this is a part two of a bigger discussion, so there are certainly people out there that could just tap in right now and enjoy the conversation for what it is, etc. There are also people out there that will benefit greatly from hearing the first half of this conversation to make sense of some of the directions that we're going. So, kind of feel your way as to which one you are and make the right decision for you. But this is a part two, so let's go ahead and get into it. And of course, I'll link to part one in the show notes so you can very quickly find it. But this is technically question 5 of a two-part episode. So the question is this: how does Althusser's refusal to accept the two idealisms that arise with Hegelianism in its non-inverted and pseudo-inverted forms tie into his critique of Friedrich Engels' letter to Joseph Bloch? And maybe it'll be helpful to recap the two idealisms and kind of give an overview of what that letter entails.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, this is probably the most difficult part of the discussion. I've been agonizing over how to approach this for months now. So yeah, just to go back to the prior discussion to help us get into this one, I'll just reread question 4 from last time. Let's look at the Hegel problem in further depth. It's one of the many Hegel problems. What is the danger of quote unquote developmental thinking for dialectics? More specifically, how does it lead us into either substance dualism or vulgar materialism, which are both forms of idealism? And on this point, why is it important? Forget that. We already touched on the stuff about the words as indices. We did that last time, so that's not really relevant. Basically, the bad inversion of Marxism, of Hegelianism, rather, Marxism as a bad inversion of Hegelianism entails arguing that nothing is really real other than the bare sort of material facts of like what is going on, right? And I think I said before that if you follow this to its logical conclusion, this sort of what we call economism, there is nothing more to be said other than we are extracting nutrients and useful things from our environment and creating things out of them, and that's all. You can boil it down to calorie counts, like vitamin levels. Exposure to light, the very, no superstructural stuff at all, just like the most nakedly material factors of life.
Reductionism, right? Reductionist materialism.
Yeah, reductionist materialism. If you follow this line, you end up, as I've said, with either a substance dualism or vulgar materialism. Substance dualism coming out of this line of argumentation would be like, well, I know that nothing's really real except the matter, the really mattery stuff, like the most eating, shitting, getting sun, getting vitamins, like just, the most like edgelord accounts of what it means to be a material being. But you may nonetheless feel, well, there's still this psychic life that I have. And it's inexplicable from the standpoint of this kind of materialism that I've now adopted. And I have no other option but to just posit this psychic life just in its own right as a completely separate, a chain of events, if you want to call it that, running alongside it with, no, unlike Spinoza, no sort of unity underpinning it and just the infinite activity of the cosmos, because, vulgar, bourgeois modes of thought don't think about the cosmos or infinity. So you end up with this like a very wishy-washy idea of the mind that can be susceptible to any kind of like new agey crap, corporate mindfulness, corporate neoliberal yoga, all this kind of depraved evil nonsense that's going on out there.
The idea of being, I'm sorry, I'm jumping in to kind of clarify things. The idea of being of substance dualism, this goes back to like Rene Descartes, that the mind and body are two fundamentally separate substances. And therefore, like in the Amazon Zen booth or whatever, there's this idea that you can sort of take care of your mind as a separate entity from your body, which is being brutalized by the toil in the Amazon warehouse. And so that is one form that this substance dualism can take. And of course, it is deeply, deeply integrated into modern society, even in Christian ideology, right? It's this idea that when you die, your body rots, your mind, your soul is liberated and goes up into heaven if you're a good boy. That substance dualism really is so deeply embedded within our common sense notions of body and mind that it's really pernicious in this way.
Yeah. And so with this first sort of material reduction, because the reality of psychic life is, you can't get away from it, you're then forced into creating just nonsensical, fantastical explanations for the mind. Now, the second pathway of this vulgar, reductionist materialism where you commit to that, you end up completely denying the reality of the mind altogether. And I believe that I told a story a few years ago about my classmate and friend Brooke back when we were in grad school at Guelph, being required to do a course about this sort of stuff. And he said, like, most of the other people in the class had bought it. And he said to them, so you're telling me that you're not actually experiencing any of what's happening right now, including me saying this to you? And they were like, yes. And it's like, and the experience you have when you look through a microscope or you do scientific inquiry into how the brain works or whatever, that's not really real either. They're like, yes. But the mathematical and scientific expressions that you come up with to convey what is happening in the brain based on your scientifically structured perception of it, that is real? And they're like, yes. And I think we could agree that that's not really tenable either.
Right.
There was a professor in that department. Sorry, Andrew, I'm throwing you under the bus here now. I remember I was taking a break one day from my own stuff and reading this paper he wrote in the student lounge. I was reading it, and it was about this pseudo-analytical philosophy concept called zombies. Have you heard of this before?
Philosophical zombies?
Have you heard this one?
Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of like, what if we could imagine a being that's absolutely identical to a human being in every single way, including their behaviors, their, apparent humanity, all of this kind of stuff, but they couldn't experience their own experience. If their own self-consciousness wasn't really there, but in every other way, they were there for you. And it's like, why are you even thinking about this in the first place?
But for gamers, it's like an NPC, right?
It's like an NPC. Yeah. And then he's like, and because none of us can satisfactorily prove to each other that this is not happening for all of us or any of us, including ourselves, maybe all of us are zombies. Mm-hmm. Maybe we're just zombies. And it's like, okay. And then it gets to the end and it's like, he says, so now the question arises, if this is true, if we cannot reduce or eliminate the possibility that all of us aren't actually really experiencing anything, what is the appropriate political system for that? Can you guess, Breht, what the answer is?
Tell me.
Some reasonable form of liberal democracy.
Nice. What a nice coincidence.
And I remember my teacher, Jeff, walked in just as I got to that part, and I was like, have you read this? And he was like, oh, yeah. I was like, this is like a bad science fiction novel. He was like, oh, yeah, they just use metaphors however they want. They just pull shit out of the air. They don't care. That's fine. They get the funding. They get all the funding, right? Yeah. Because if, the kind of being that view wants you to be doesn't really need solidarity or to change their social conditions or human togetherness. It's just gears and levers. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So it denies the immediacy of what's most immediately real, which is like your own experience. So clearly this is not. And it's your own experience in conjunction with that of others that gets you the scientific insights that you then use to deny the thing that got you there. So it's like, okay, this isn't satisfactory either. Okay? And these are two forms of idealism. So that's just to recap to lead into...
So really quick, though, Matthew, the two forms of idealism is this substance dualism and this vulgar reductionist materialism?
Yes, that's correct,
right.
Yeah.
And really quickly, just on that point, I come out of a philosophy background, and of course, philosophy of mind is a big, segment of philosophy, and we read figures like Dan Dennett, who just recently actually died. And, I like Dan Dennett. I read his books. I don't agree with his conclusions, but he's obviously an interesting and worthwhile thinker to engage with. And, him dying is obviously not something to celebrate. It's sort of a sad thing. But he had this straight up idea that consciousness itself is more or less an illusion. And there's a strain of thought within the philosophy of mind called eliminativism, which their solution to the problem of consciousness, like what is consciousness, et cetera, is to basically say that it is sort of an illusion, that it doesn't actually exist in any real way, and that would kind of make us, in some sense, some version of a philosophical zombie, a zombie being somebody who outwardly has physical attributes, who goes around and does things, but the lights aren't on the inside, as it were, right? There's no conscious person experience and reflecting upon experience on the inside. It's just this sort of body in the world doing things. And that's what we mean by sort of reductive materialism. But it is taken incredibly seriously in bourgeois academia and in philosophy.
Yeah, and again, I think it's because it underwrites a lot of, especially in the neoliberal period that we may slowly be coming out of now, because the rest of the world is kicking the West in the teeth finally.
Yes.
It just there are no political problems, there are no social problems, there are no emotional problems, there are no interpersonal problems, there are no ethical problems, there are any aesthetic problems. Everything is just a technical problem, and it can be fixed by something. And if your illusion is bothering you, we'll have a pill for that or something for that. But that's all that really needs to be done about it, right?
And that's also a great point that highlights this vulgar materialism, is this idea that a pill can solve your problem, because ultimately the mind is reducible to the body. And so neurobiology is matter, is material. A pill is material that acts on the material of the brain, the physical manifestation of the quote-unquote mind, which doesn't actually exist. It's reducible to the physical brain. Ergo, putting this pill in your body that acts neurochemically will solve your problems, even if, and that completely eliminates the possibility that these problems are material in origin, that they're a result of stress and needless toil, of exploitation, of alienation. All those questions are completely set aside and genuinely not even thought about, because it's just a physical specimen in need of a physical intervention. And there's nothing mental, material, really important, psychological, or dare I say spiritual, that deserves even our slightest amount of attention. In fact, you mention a word like spiritual and you're completely laughed out of a room of people who think like this. So that's kind of fleshing out that idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's a whole line of inquiry we could get into about that with there is a French philosopher of science that a lot of people don't know named Michel Serres, who's very highly respected by the people that we usually talk about. Mm-hmm. And Deleuze is sort of along the same wavelength as him, and it's like we need to treat consciousness. We are comfortable with extensive qualities like length, width, and depth, but we don't think a lot about what are called in like chemistry or, for example, or also physics, intensive qualities like temperature, for example, or pressure, things like that. He said they're both, both of them articulate ideas, and Guattari is one of these people who comes along with this as well when he and Deleuze talk about the brain. Again, not postmodernists. Postmodernists would not talk about the brain.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about the brain for their whole last chapter of what is philosophy. And they're like, we need to rethink the mind in a way that's consistent with rigorous materialism, but still accounts for the fact that it's an incorporeal in relative to, things that have, length, width, and depth and hardness or softness and all that kind of stuff. We need to think of the consciousness in the mind is something more akin to like a temperature or something like that. There's a whole line of inquiry we could go down there, but not today.
Sure.
Okay, so this will help us get into question 5. So how does Althusser's, I'll just repeat it, how does Althusser's refusal to accept the two idealisms that arise with Hegelianism in its non-inverted and its pseudo-inverted forms tie into his critique of Friedrich Engels' letter to Joseph Bloch? And so this is important to me too, because this letter is actually, along with Contradiction and Overdetermination, I would say they are the two texts that I had in the background when we began the Dialectics Deep Dive. Because on the surface of it, and in many ways, Engels' account here of how history works is very appealing, and it makes a lot of sense, and it actually can be helpful in a preliminary way, in the same way that, some of the distinctions and cons, just bourgeoisie versus proletariat, without getting into the intermingling and the complications of that. Even though it doesn't, bourgeoisie versus proletariat just on its own doesn't raise to the level of the complexity of that, it's still enough to get you started.
Exactly.
And what Engels does, I think, is enough to get you started, but there are still dangers in it. And I think Althusser's criticisms are very helpful because they, when we unpack it a little bit, hopefully it'll clarify a little bit more what we've been doing in the whole deep dive series now for the last 3 years.
Cool.
And so I'll just start with the letter to Bloch. I'll just read a couple of passages from it that are key.
So this is Friedrich Engels writing to Joseph Bloch, and then we're going to talk about Althusser's critique of it.
Yes, exactly. So this is to Joseph Bloch, I think written from London over September 21 and 22, 1890. So Engels is quite up there at this point. And I've read this part before, but I need to read this so I can get into the next part. According to the materialist... I'll start again. Quote, according to the materialist conception of history, the ultimately determining element in history is the production and reproduction of real life. More than this, neither Marx nor I have ever asserted. Hence, if somebody twists this into saying that the economic element is the only determining one, he transforms that proposition into a meaningless, abstract, senseless phrase. The economic situation is the basis, but the various elements of the superstructure, political forms of the class struggle and its results, to wit, constitutions established by the victorious class after a successful battle, etc., juridical forms, and then even the reflexes of all these actual struggles in the brains of the participants, political, juristic, philosophical theories, religious views, and their further development into systems of dogmas, also exercise their influence upon the course of the historical struggles, and in many cases preponderate in determining their form. There is an interaction of all these elements in which, amid all the endless host of accidents, that is, of things and events whose interconnection is so remote or so impossible of proof that we can regard it as non-existent, as negligible, the economic movement finally asserts itself as necessary. Otherwise, the application of this theory to any period of history one chose would be easier than the solution of a simple equation of the first degree. Okay, so I'm going to skip the second paragraph where he talks about linguistic shifts in Germany over a certain. He's trying to give these examples. So I've already read that before, so I'm just going to skip that and go to the next part. In the second place, however, history is made in such a way that the final result always arises from conflicts between many individual wills, of which each again has been made what it is by a host of particular conditions of life. Thus there are innumerable intersecting forces, an infinite series of parallelograms of forces which give rise to one resultant, the historical event. This may again be itself viewed as the product of a power which works as a whole unconsciously and without volition. For what each individual wills is obstructed by everyone else, and what emerges is something that no one willed. Thus, past history proceeds in the manner of a natural process and is essentially subject to the same laws of motion. But from the fact that individual wills, of which each desires what he is impelled to by his physical constitution and external, in the last resort, economic circumstances, either his own personal circumstances or those of society in general, do not attain what they want, but are merged into a collective meaning, a common resultant, it must not be concluded that their value is equal to zero. On the contrary, each contributes to the resultant and is to this degree involved in it, end quote. And that's a chunky passage right there. And hopefully we can break it down. But on the surface of it, have you read this letter before, Breht?
I don't think so. I don't think I've read it. Yeah,
it's in the back of the Marx and Engels reader from W.W. Norton and Company. There's a certain appeal to it that makes a whole lot of sense. Like a parallelogram of forces is a concept that Engels borrows from physics. And if anyone listening is better at me than physics and math, which you almost certainly are, if you want to jump into the comments on the Patreon page or whatever and help me with this, it's basically a concept to consider the application of two forces to the same object, and then the resulting outcome of that. And in pure physics, I mean, again, I'm not that great at all this stuff. I've struggled with math all my life, and I'm still working on getting better at it. So I don't know. Again, and it involves linear algebra, I think. So the whatever I think the resultant would be expressed in this way in some sort of algebraic expression, right? And so he's transposing this physical concept to the situation of, for example, it's like I go to work and my boss comes into work, to the extent that bosses ever come into work, and he is trying to achieve his interest and I'm trying to achieve my interest, both of us acting on this business enterprise that we belong to in these two, asymmetrical ways in which he has the upper hand and I have the lower hand. And because of the way that both of us bring our will to bear on this object that we have this mutual, yet diametrically opposed interest in, the outcome is really not what either of us wanted. And anyone that's ever worked for a small business owner, you listen to how much they complain about shit and about nothing is going their way. You know that Engels is on point here. Mm-hmm. Even though it's like, sorry, bud, you're starting all the revenues up and you can't stay ahead of your creditors, but that's not because of your workers, that's because of you. Anyway, sorry, a little specific there. That's not from any real experience, believe me. Anyway, it's purely made up. But that's the sort of model of it, right? In the big picture, it's bourgeoisie proletariat on the activities of the mode of production, and it comes out. These two forces, operate on the same field, if you can put it that way, or in the same sphere or domain, both bringing to bear diametrically opposed but mutually intermingled interests. And then the outcome is not what anyone asked for, because you know that, because it's an ongoing, never-ending struggle of pushing and pulling, and each side trying to get their way, right? Mm-hmm. And, in Marxism, Leninism, the answer is, well, ultimately, the working class will eventually get their way. But anyway, we'll set that aside for the moment. But so you can see there's a certain kind of, it makes a certain kind of common sense.
Really
right?
quick, can I do an example possibly from history?
Yeah, sure.
You have the rise of Napoleon, right, as the Emperor of France, and that is neither. That is a result of a multifaceted amount of like sort of causal elements that created Napoleon as this emperor, but that is neither what the monarchists of the rest of Europe who were trying to stop Napoleon and more deeply the French Revolution wanted, nor is it what the French revolutionaries themselves who created the conditions which gave rise to Napoleon wanted. So you can kind of see Napoleon himself as this sort of figure that emerges from a multitude of causes that none of the major contending forces necessarily wanted, right? Napoleon is not in a hereditary line of monarchs, so even though he's an emperor, he's not what the monarchs had in mind. And of course, he's not what the French revolutionaries who created the possibility of this young Corsican to rise through the ranks and become emperor necessarily wanted, but that he's sort of the result of these sort of multifaceted causal forces that emerge anyway. And I think that might be one way to highlight this historically.
Yeah, and for me, another thing I keep thinking about when I'm thinking about this is just like a lot of my favorite rap albums from the 90s, people describing the situation of living, as a black person subjected to capitalism in these like urban environments and having to compete with others to get yours at the end of the day. Like New York State of Mind by Nas, like I ran like a cheetah with thoughts of an assassin. You're a will that's out there competing with other wills that are coming at you, or it's like, you and your crew or whatever. But it's the same thing. And then the resultant of these activities coming into conflict with each other, trying to achieve their goals by operating again on the same field. The resultant is a world that nobody can really say that they really wanted, even though they're living in it and they helped cause it. Right. So this is what, what Engels means when he says, just because it's not what anybody in any individual will wanted, doesn't mean that they themselves, their causality in this is canceled out because the result does not correspond to their intentions. They're still a causal factor in the outcome of the what he called the resultant, which is the historical event, as he says. And so, again, yeah, it makes a lot of sense, but Althusser uses it, and I think this is the most difficult part of the essay. This is the appendix to the essay. And it's only 10 pages long, and I've gone over this, and I find it so hard. And I'll do my best. But basically, I'll just try to boil it down. And he's saying, first of all, where do the wills come from? Right. And Engels says, well, it's physical circumstance or physical condition or physical composition, physical constitution, and external circumstances. And for Althusser, I think because he's just spent all this time defending the efficacy of the superstructure, he's going to say, well, Engels is not doing a good enough job of showing the dialectical development of the wills, right? And he's remember that, and Lenin also, I think it's in the question of dialectics, which is taken out of his conspectus on Hegel's Science of Logic. He says that, Engels in his writing doesn't do a good enough job of showing how the mind is generated out of not just the economic base, but also the superstructure as well. And so the will itself is something that's unwilled in the first instance. It's not just the outcome of what they will is of the wills is unwilled. It's that the will itself, to some extent, is unwilled. Right. So, and if you're a Spinozist, that's not a problem. But if you're a bourgeois ideologue, that is a massive problem. Right. If you are someone that is committed to being a philosopher, say, within the confines of Western Anglo-American academia, the idea that you might have to give up, the quote unquote, the bourgeois self, that absolute starting point that is not caused by anything else, but that causes everything else. That is the most hateful thing you can possibly imagine. And I think that part of the terrible reception that the four French thinkers that I've named a number of times, so Deleuze, Guattari, Derrida, and Foucault, they have been smeared as postmodernists and post-structuralists precisely because they reject the idea that this sort of consciousness of this like bourgeois consciousness that is almost like it's not really created per se by anything else. It's not generated by any other factors. It doesn't have to riff on Thich Nhat Hanh, it's a self that does not have non-self elements. These four thinkers, for example, and Althusser is one that precedes them, would say that no, this is a self that must have non-self elements, or else you can't make any sense of it. And he's saying to Engels, I think, like you're losing the non-self elements, and because you're losing the non-self elements, you're losing the self elements, and because you're losing both, your example kind of falls on its face, and all you're really left with is this sort of model of bourgeois ideology where it's like, hey, I'm here in the world, I'm out to get mine. And it's like, so it was a well-intentioned explanatory model, but the further you try to rely on it, the more troubling and the more problematic that it gets. Does that make sense at all?
Absolutely. Very interesting. Yeah. So So Engels is given this sort of, like you were saying earlier, this bird's eye view, this helpful concept, this way into understanding something. And Althusser is saying, okay, as a very shallow sort of initiation point, that might be helpful. But once we start thinking about it very deeply, the nuances and complexities begin to arise, and this is not technically correct. The point you made about the bourgeois conception of the will, you really got to think about this idea that this will plays this idea that you are this self-directed, from the inside out individual that can act rationally. This underpins the entire economy, the justice system, etc. This is the idea of homo economicus, right? This rational actor with choices who goes out into the marketplace of commodities and goods and services and makes rational choices in their own self-interest, right? Which has a bunch of assumptions about the person having a will in the first place, where that will comes from, their even ability to acknowledge or know what their self-interests actually are. And of course, in the judicial system, this idea of like libertarian free will, that your actions are a direct product of your self-motivated will and thus are accountable and culpable to the broader society, and you can be penalized for your choices because they are ultimately, in the last instance, your own. And any real deep dive into the philosophy of free will, even this sort of discussion begins to immediately cast doubt on that idea that will even exists. And of course, if you go into Buddhism, right, what happens when you see through the illusion of the self? You simultaneously and instantaneously see through the illusion of free will, which is centered on this idea of a self. So, and maybe there's a diversion between a Marxist and a Buddhist conception of the self, certainly, but in the Buddhist context, this also vibes quite well because, this debate about does free will exist or not? You can go have philosophy classes all day long and debate, are you a libertarian free will? Are you a determinist? Are you a compatibilist? If you meditate long enough, you don't have to have those questions anymore. You don't have to have those debates. You can look inwardly and immediately, and of course, this is a high level of achievement. But once you get there, you can immediately look inward and see that the self and the will that you think exists there in the first place are ultimately illusory. And I think Althusser sort of complicating this idea of the will as merely a product of nature and nurture, as Engels is sort of kind of asserting here, I think disintegrates around the fringes and maybe even strikes at the center of this very idea of a will. So those are just some thoughts that came up when you were talking.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's all very helpful commentary. And I'm just going to read from Althusser from the, I think it's just the first page and a bit from the appendix to Contradiction and Overdetermination, because he says, I think his line of argumentation is, if you rely too heavily on the model that Engels has advanced, as I think, and again, on some level, it is a helpful teaching tool, right? It's not, again, in dialectical materialism, we don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're constantly engaged in a kind of creative interpretation of flawed lines of argumentation according to the principles that we observe, which again, the unity of opposites, the dialectical transformation of quantity into quality, and these two in the context of history as defined by class struggle, ultimately culminating in the abolition of classes, right? So we're not just going to throw Engels out. It can still be made use of, and the truth in it can still be seen, but we also need to identify the dangers in it. And I think it's not just the danger of relying on this model too much or too heavily or taking it too much for granted. It's not just that you end up back in bourgeois philosophizing, but you lose the effectivity of the superstructures. And with losing the effectivity of the superstructures, you lose the ability to carry out a Marxist analysis of the effectivity of the superstructures, and thereby actually get a better sense of what your will is actually composed of and how it's composed and how it operates and how it can be altered, which is bringing us back to Spinoza once again. So I'll just read from this appendix here. So, quote, Engels has just shown that the superstructures, far from being pure phenomena of the economy, have their own effectivity. Quote within a quote, the various elements of the superstructure in many cases preponderate in determining their, and then, in parentheses, Althusser just reminds you Engels means the historical struggles, so their historical form, end quote within a quote. But this quote poses the question as to how, under these conditions, we should think the unity of this real but relative effectivity of the superstructures and of the determinant principle in the last instance of the economy. So just to repeat that. So what's the unity of the real but relative effectivity of the superstructures and the determinant principle of the economy? So what is the unity of the base and the superstructure? Because we can't just see them as two separate things, nor can we collapse one into the other. We have to see them as two things that are distinct from one another, yet nonetheless in a unity with one another. How do we think that? It's the unity of opposites, right? Mm-hmm. Continuing, how should we think the relation between these distinct effectivities? What basis is there within this unity for the role of the economic as a last instance? Engels' reply is that, quote within a quote, there is an interaction of all these elements, the superstructures, in which amid all the endless host of accidents, that is, of events and the things and events whose interconnection is so remote or so impossible of proof that we can regard it as non-existent, as negligible, the economic movement finally asserts itself as necessary, end quote within a quote. So the explanatory model goes like this, quote within a quote, the various elements of the superstructure, end quote within a quote, act and react on each other to produce an infinity of effects. These effects can be assimilated to an infinity of accidents, infinite in number and with an interconnection so remote and therefore so difficult to discover that it is negligible, amid which the quote-unquote economic movement asserts itself. These effects are accidents. The economic movement is necessity, their necessity. So the economic movement is the necessity of these superstructural accidents. Right. So in other words, they're pure phenomena of what's truly essential, which is the economic base. So Althusser is indicating that Engels is already slipping back into a kind of bad Hegelianism here. Continuing. For the moment, I shall ignore the accidents necessity model and its presuppositions. What is remarkable in this text is the role that it attributes to the different elements of the superstructure. It is just as if, once the action-reaction system was set in motion between them, they were charged with finding a basis for the infinite diversity of effects, things and events, as Engels puts it, between which, as if between so many accidents, the economy picks its sovereign way. In other words, the elements of the superstructure do have an effectivity, but this effectivity is in some way dispersed into an infinity, into the infinity of effects, of accidents, whose interconnection may, once this extremity in the infinitesimal has been reached, be regarded as non-existent. So comment. So what he's saying is that, yes, we're bombarded and, so saturated all day long, every single day with, television news, memes, social media streams, billboards, guy with a sandwich board walking on the street advertising club sandwich at a dime, all this stuff, political edicts, press statements, anything superstructural that you could possibly think of. They affect us and shape us and move us, but then yet nonetheless, Althusser suggests, according to the way Engels is treating this, they nonetheless are all lost. Like they're not in the end really part of the effectiveness of the will that you bring to the table when you're competing with the other wills and creating the unwilled resultant of the total historical event. So he's saying there's a problem here, right? So precisely that which informs and shapes the wills and makes them what they are is lost to all knowledge. And then we're still stuck back with this kind of like bourgeois starting point. So this is a problem. And here, I think Althusser is really echoing Gramsci, who's trying to say, who says that we need to consider the way that the superstructures operate in our minds and motivate us to act, not as a psychological problem, but an epistemological problem. We need to study these things as though they have structures that can be rationally apprehended and transformed into some kind of knowledge, right? So this is, for example, why I made sure that we did an episode about Marshall McLuhan. Because despite not being a Marxist and having certain blind spots because of that, he does a very fine-grained analysis of media formations, and he has a book called I think it's called The New Science. I can't remember what it's called, The New Science, and he co-wrote it with his son, and he's laying out these sort of formal epistemological structure that you can use to apprehend not just media formations, but their transformations into other formations and their interactions with other formations. So that, and also Althusser, I don't know if he was aware of McLuhan, but I think Althusser would say, well, here's somebody, despite not being a Marxist and having some of the shortcomings that go along with that, who is nonetheless showing that media effects, superstructural effects, are intelligible, and through apprehending their intelligibility, we can have a better account of their effectivity in our actions, so that we're not just stuck with this model of, well, there's just the wills, and then they collide, and then there's an historical event. Althusser is trying to say that as Marxists, we can and must go further, and the resources are there for us to go further and to get a better sense of what our minds actually are by being better materialists. So is that helpful at all?
Yeah, so let me try to give my articulation of what's being said here. That Althusser is saying that the will, and let me know if I'm wrong here, because this is, admittedly sort of complicated to follow these lines all the way through. The will is sort of, it's not merely the result of nature and nurture. It's certainly not the libertarian will of just a completely self-motivated individual that is sort of concretized in bourgeois rule. It is in many ways superstructurally constituted, and this gives rise, or this is, this is pointing towards the superstructural effectivity, that the will is superstructurally constituted, but the superstructural ephemera that constitute given wills historically is sort of lost to time in a similar way that all of the superstructural ephemera that you made a long list of these things that we deal with in modernity, the TikTok influencers and the CNN image and the billboard and this and that. A lot of that is sort of that ephemera is lost historically. When we look back on history, we don't necessarily see all the ways in which that superstructural ephemera were constructing wills, and therefore by not seeing that, we kind of lose sight of that effective role that the superstructure plays, and that losing of the sight of that superstructural role can then return us to this error of these ideas of the will constructed in these poor or simplistic ways. Is that kind of in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, and it's what Althusser is offering you is a safeguard against all sorts of like chauvinisms and dogmatisms and all this kind of stuff that come along with falling into just sort of a philosophical model of these kind of philosophical abstract, like the will, the resultant, the forces, all this kind of stuff. Althusser is saying, and he's saying to Engels too, don't lose sight of your own Marxism. The answer is in the mode of production and in practice, right? It's all resolved in practice. It's like Allen Iverson. It's like, we're talking about practice. Practice, man. I've deterritorialized his and reterritorialized it into another. I Deleuze Allen Iverson. But yeah, so and again,
by the way, I don't think Deleuze and Guattari and Allen Iverson have ever been uttered in the same sentence ever in the history of Earth. So good job, Matthew.
Oh, I'm always breaking new ground, Although Deleuze, he has a really funny analysis of John McEnroe, the tennis player, but we can talk about that another time. So yeah, he's again, it's like you don't. I guess the underlying point is that, yes, philosophical abstractions like the will, or, I may touch on Sartre's critique of dialectical reason here in a minute, interiority, exteriority, yes, they have a certain value, but let's not forget that this is scientific socialism. So whatever, and like our scientific investigations of how our minds are formed and, our actions are shaped and induced or brought forth, that doesn't have to map on one-to-one to a philosophical model of the mind that we may happen to be entertaining, right? It doesn't, and again, this is very counterintuitive for especially, like, I would say, Anglo-American academic philosophy, where everything kind of does have to line up like that, and if it doesn't line up like that, something's wrong, everyone's unhappy, you don't get funding, right? It's all these disasters follow from it. But in this approach that Althusser is bringing, influenced by Lenin, influenced by Gramsci, also influenced by Spinoza, and obviously influenced by Marx, He's saying we just don't need to even accept that whole framing of things, because everything is in motion. And that's just how it's just a fact of life that as you're doing these kinds of investigations into the base of the superstructure or whatever, some new philosophy of mind might come down the line. And you're like, oh, maybe I should, let's entertain that and let's see how that might fit into something. But what is not asked for is before you even start playing the game, you get all your ducks in a row and you have all your inferences laid out and you have all your principal concepts. That's just not how Marxism works, right? And he's saying that Engels is, despite his best intentions, straying a little bit too far away from proper Marxism and giving people an opening for, again, a very well-intentioned and pedagogically well-intentioned and well-meant trope, and then turning it into a philosophical dogmatism. So we need to kind of resist that, is what I think Althusser is saying.
Well said. So 2 points before we move on to the next question. And as a side note, I just love that we can spend an hour on one question here. But going back, kind of closing the circuit on this entire discussion for this question, going back to the substance dualism and vulgar materialism and applying it not to the body and mind, but now applying it to base and superstructure, we can see a substance dualist approach to base and superstructure, which sort of sees them as separable, as things that aren't sort of co-constitutive, a sort of idea that the superstructure is merely a different substance, and maybe one result of that is that it doesn't have effectivity on the base. It doesn't turn around and then influence the base, which can lead to errors. And then the vulgar materialism would be to try to reduce the superstructure to the base, in the same way that modern cognitive scientists or philosophers attempt to reduce the mind to the body. That can lead to a sort of economism, a vulgar materialism in the realm of Marxism, where the superstructure itself is sort of just reduced to the base, and therefore it's stripped of its actual causal powers.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's just streaming by you, and it doesn't actually mean or do anything. And so, so if you can understand what Althusser is saying here, and you entertain my repeated claim that I've made over the last few years that people like Foucault and them are not postmodernists or anything of the sort that they've been described as in the West, and you understand what Althusser is saying, as Breht and I have just laid it out, you can understand what they're doing, and you can see how, even if they're not perfect Marxists, even if they're not revolutionary leaders, which again, none of us are, who are listening, you can understand how it's still useful, right? You can still engage with that stuff and consider its errors, right? Whatever errors they may be there, and still see how, in the line of Althusser, what they're trying to do is precisely to give and to show give to and show the intelligibility of all of these superstructural motions and transformations and effects that are happening all the time in us, around us, through us, and that this is really what defines, in many ways, like our life as social beings, our psychic life, you might say, as social beings. And that's, it just, this is a slight tangent. That's what sort of gutted me over the last 20 years. And I started out as a hater of Foucault. I was, this often happens with me. I started out as a hater, and I hated him because I'm a Marxist. And then I started to see, oh, geez, I've been misled by these certain ways of curating readings and pulling lines out, and, and I over a lot of hard work, I came to realize, wow, this stuff is really useful. This shows, this is their answer in a way, because I think Foucault, for example, is often taken to be critical of Marxism as a whole. I've found, the more deeply you read, he's really criticizing French Marxism at the time that he's there, and not even all French Marxism. Basically, the kinds of French Marxism that are influenced by like Merleau-Ponty and Sartre, where they do sort of presuppose this kind of like unshakable baseline consciousness that is the sort of seat of the will. And so Foucault kind of lines up, and Deleuze and those guys, they line up along with Althusser, who is sort of lining himself up along with like Marx in the trajectory of Spinoza, right? And again, as Hegel says, basically, you can't even understand me if you don't understand Spinoza. You can't be a philosopher if you're not a Spinozist, so therefore you can't be a Hegelian, and by extension, you can't be a Marxist. And I think that that's really what they're bringing back, is like this material analysis of the mind as emerging through a social, mode of organization, a mode of production, precisely what Voloshinov is talking about in the 1920s, right? Anyway, so that's just a little tangent there.
Well, I think you highlight the proper Marxist approach to all thinkers, to these thinkers, is that it's not a binary, right? It's not this person is right or this person is wrong. This person is good or this person is bad. You go into the thinker, you explore it skeptically, critically. You understand the thought itself as a sort of product of dialectical materialism, right? Philosophy itself is a superstructural phenomenon in the final instance, and you engage with it on those terms. And a thinker like Foucault, who is in part reacting to the Marxist tradition, and particularly his cultural and historical iterations of Marxism, can at the same time be critical of core elements of Marxism, while at the same time offering kernels of very fascinating truth and lines of inquiry that might not always be present in mainline Marxism. And you can take that, engage with it, and your Marxism comes out better equipped to deal with the actual world in its actual state of constant evolution, and not this dead, binary, dogmatic way of approaching reality, which is this is either Marxist or this is not Marxist. And we can go back to Marx himself, who engaged deeply with figures like David Ricardo and Smith, and took insights garnered from them. They're by no means are they Marxist, right? But took thoughts and extended them, took the kernels of truth out of them, disregarded the kernels of untruth, and developed a deeper analysis of capitalism and of economics than they did. But if he would have came to them and said, oh, these are bourgeois economists, they're immediately wrong, I have nothing to learn from them, Das Kapital wouldn't have been created, right? So I think that's important. And the other thing I wanted to say is one of the things that's at stake in these, we're talking about substance dualism and vulgar materialism. We've talked about both of those and how they sort of manifest in our society. But interestingly enough, I'm currently in a high level 4,000 level history class right now on the Holocaust, and we open up the class with struggling with these interpretations. And in fact, our main paper, the bulk of our grade, is centered on this paper where we take a position with regards to how the Holocaust happened. Do you take a structuralist position, which is basically that these deeper structural and functionalist forces gave rise ultimately to what we now call the Holocaust, the industrial attempt to eliminate European Jewry? Or do you take an intentionalist approach, which puts the locus of the Holocaust in the intentions and wills of Hitler himself and the top Nazi politicians and figures and architects, right? And it kind of gets down to this idea of structural forces versus individualist great men of history theories of how the Holocaust happened. And I wrote my entire paper, of course, comes from a structuralist approach. My idea is, like, if Hitler himself had never been born, the Nazi Party and the Holocaust, they would have still happened, because they were determined not by an individual's will, but by structural forces. Maybe the name of the party would have been different. Maybe the colors they chose would have been different. Maybe the Holocaust would have played out slightly differently, but the basic thing itself was not determined by the intentions or wills of any individuals or group of individuals, but by deeper structural issues that were operating above and beyond the conscious control or even conscious comprehension of individuals. That doesn't mean that they're not culpable. It doesn't mean they're not evil sons of bitches who deserve to die. But it does mean that the ultimate causes are much deeper than any one person's intentions. But I say all of this to say that when we're being taught that, the Marxist position is presented, and this is bourgeois, academia. The Marxist position on this stuff, which is structural, which is nuanced, which takes into consideration base and superstructures' relations to one another, is presented in a high-level graduate course on the Holocaust as vulgar materialism. The Marxist position, as uttered by my professor, who I like, right, is that the Marxists think that the economic situation caused the Holocaust, that, these fat cats, these capitalists wanted to maintain their economic control and regain economic wealth in the wake of World War I, and that wills and intentions and cultures and ideologies are meaningless and don't matter. So the way that bourgeois academics teach Marxism is through the vulgar reductionist materialist error of Marxism. Yeah.
Christ Jesus, yes, yes. Like, it's that it happened to me. Like, I was first exposed to Marx in that before I went to university, right? And then to the extent that I was exposed to it in university, I got the impression for a long time that Marx himself is a material reductionist, because that's what, I mean, Jordan Peterson, like, he reduces everything to just as an oppressor class and an oppressed class, and, you know, all this kind of shit. And just to bring it back to Foucault for a second, that's exactly what so, you know, again, I've seen so many people, I hate this French theory shit, and I hate that shit too, right? I hate that the way that these people have been packaged into this crap. But that is exactly, you know, we talk about structures and then, you know, features of structures differing, even though those structures can be the same. That's exactly the kind of thing that's levied at Foucault, which is that, well, just as Marx reduces everything to class, Foucault reduces everything to power, and there's no agency, right? It's completely inane. It just, you know, and it's part of why I hated Foucault at first, because, you know, and the same thing has sort of been done to Althusser. And I did hear, I think was in your discussion with Allison about the 18th Brumaire, where you or Allison, I can't remember which, said, you know, Althusser sort of leans more towards this structuralist tendency. And a lot of that in itself, too, is also the way he's read in Western academia, because another thing he does, he's constantly exploring, like, the agency of Lenin, for example. And it's like, there's all these structural things happening, but then there's Lenin, right? So he's there, and, like, his agency is key to I mean, the agency of everyone that was involved is key, but he's analyzing Lenin as this particular figure, right? So he doesn't reduce agency himself at all, right? But all of these thinkers like Marx, Althusser, Foucault, they all get accused of this themselves, of this, like, material reduction, of vulgar materialism, which itself is what propels bourgeois ideology. And it's a way of either bringing them inside or keeping them outside completely. And I would just say, like, don't ever underestimate how much distortion academia in the West applies to anything related to Marx in any way, shape, or form. And just, like, to clue up on that, just for example, go look at the debate with Chomsky. Foucault is, like, vigorously defending revolutionary Marxism against what I think is a pretty appalling and violent kind of anti-communism that Chomsky articulates, to the point that he says, if I knew that there was a Marxist-Leninist movement happening in America that could lead to something, I would try to stop it. And Foucault is like, what are you know, and Foucault is like, but these things that, you know, this representation of Marxist-Leninists as these bloodthirsty maniacs that doesn't really wash, right? I'm paraphrasing, of course. Mm-hmm. And then Chomsky says, yeah, but which Marxist-Leninist would ever dare to say that out loud? That they want to destroy the whole world and kill everyone? Who would, which, you know, and Foucault, like, right? And then Chomsky comes out of that at the end saying Foucault is amoral. And then Foucault gets smeared in the West as this nihilistic postmodern. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. All you have to do is read the texts in their entirety. But just, the Western academia and pop culture is such a really powerful, like, refractory or, like, refractive medium that, you know, like, look at how bad they distort Marx. They do it to many, many others as well.
Absolutely. Well said. And, you know, I'll have to read my paper that I wrote for that class on that topic of structuralism versus intentionalism, because I robustly defend a Marxist approach to history. And in that paper, I talk about the relationship between the superstructure and the base, and how Marxists do not discount ideology. We do not discount individual agency. We do not discount culture, etc. I complicate that entire narrative. And I only was given 2,000 to 2,500 words, and I went 4,000. So I'll see if I get docked on that. But I had
that happens.
I had to come in with it. All right.
I've been there many times. Oh, I have one last thing. Oh, okay. There was one last thing to say. Oh man, I lost it. Maybe it'll come back to me. I'm sorry.
If it comes back, just let me know.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's go on to question number 2. Okay, so in light of Althusser's critique of Engels, let's look more closely at the concept of a survival, quote unquote, a survival. What content does Althusser give to this concept of survival, and how does it pertain to our struggles with the superstructure? What are some key survivals that haunt us today, and how do they impede us from seeing things clearly through Marxist theory?
Oh, wait, I just remembered the thing that I forgot.
Perfect.
If you want to really understand where, like, Althusser and the people that I just talked about is following from, where they stand in relation to structuralism, and this whole post-structuralism, there's a lot of crap. Basically, you can understand where they're coming from if you just understand that for them, structures and transformations are not opposites, or in the sense of, they cancel each other out, right? That structures themselves are motions and transformations. And if you can understand that, then you can understand what they're doing, and they're not. So like when they're accused of being, or like Foucault or someone is being accused of being a post-structuralist, it's like, oh, they don't like structures, man. Everything's discontinuous and fragmentary. And that's not what they're saying at all. They're just saying that we have to remember that structures themselves are also motions and changes and transformations. That's all.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
Amateurs out there. Can't even. Sorry.
All right. So let's get into that question around survival. Maybe explain to us what is meant by that, and the survivals that haunt us today is an intriguing question.
Yeah, well, I think the best way to get into this is return to the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And I highly recommend, if people haven't listened to this yet, that excellent episode that Breht did with Allison about the 18th Brumaire. Absolutely fascinating. One of the best episodes I've heard on the show, I think.
Thank you.
And so really I think maybe the best way to convey what Althusser means by survival is just to read from the 18th Brumaire. And we can just start really from the very beginning and then read just a couple of paragraphs. So, quote, Hegel remarks somewhere that all great world historical facts and personages occur, as it were, twice. He has forgotten to add, the first time as tragedy, the second as farce. Caussidière for Danton, Louis Blanc for Robespierre, the mountain of 1848 to 1851 for the mountain of 1793 to 1795. Comment. The university protests going on about Gaza today for the protests of the 60s over Vietnam or what happened in France. There's an example of the survival, in that sense.
Nice.
Continuing, the nephew for the uncle. And the same caricature occurs in the circumstances in which the second edition of the 18th Brumaire is taking place. Men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly found, given, and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living, and just when they seem engaged in revolutionizing themselves and things, in creating something entirely new, precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past. Comment. Remember the Tea Party in 2009, right? Continuing, to their service and borrow from them names, battle slogans, and costumes in order to present the new scene of world history in this time-honored disguise in this borrowed language. Thus, Luther donned the mask of the Apostle Paul. The Revolution of 1789 to 1814 draped itself alternately as the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, and the Revolution of 1848 knew nothing better than to do than to parody, in turn, 1789 and the revolutionary tradition of 1793 to 1795. In like manner, the beginner who has learnt a new language always translates it back into his mother tongue, but he has assimilated the spirit of the new language and can produce freely in it only when he moves in it without remembering the old and forgets in it his ancestral tongue. End quote. What Althusser is trying to say is that the movements of the superstructure, of the various superstructural sort of items and dynamics and relationships and all that, and the way that they are expressed through us in social action, does not map on to the way that the mode of production changes. There's delays, right? There's weird asynchronies or dyssynchronies, if you want to put it that way, so that you're, even though you're materially, physically in the present, you may be, or have to in some sense, because the words aren't there yet, you may have to rely on tropes from the past in order to move into the future and develop new tropes that actually do pertain to the new material conditions, right? So, for example, the Soviet Union is gone, but nonetheless, it's still evoked in like so many ways by Marxists all around the world. And nonetheless, the Soviet Union is not something that, despite what, like certainly Vladimir Putin is not trying to restart the Soviet Union. Whatever comes in the future will never be just a replication of something like the Soviet Union. What comes in the future will, in some, to sort of give Engels his due here, is something that, to a certain extent, nobody asked for. In a way, and then we'll have to deal with that. As Mao says, the contradictions don't stop. When you move from capitalism to socialism, the contradictions continue. And so there's always this kind of like slippage between your actual present material circumstances and then the superstructural ways you have of dealing with it. And so just to go on a little tangent, so the collection of lectures that I mentioned last time by Jacques Derrida, called Spectres of Marx, that's exactly what in a way, it's like an Althusserian homage to the 18th Brumaire. That's one way of describing Spectres of Marx. It's very much like the 18th Brumaire. Anyway, maybe it's like an 18th Brumerian way of paying homage to the 18th Brumaire. And he starts out with quoting a passage from Hamlet. Let us go in together and still your fingers on your lips, I pray. The time is out of joint, O cursed spite that ever I was born to set it right. Nay, come, let's go together. And he keeps hammering on this thing, the time is out of joint, the time is out of joint. And he's doing it to respond to, among other people, Francis Fukuyama, and he's responding to the whole specter that it was posed to us in the early 90s of the end of history, and interrogating that and being like, what is that? It's insane. But you're now saying that the only sort of valid superstructural items that could possibly still exist are those that pertain to like bourgeois, neoliberal, imperialist capitalism. And everything else is obsolete now. And Derrida is, I think, drawing on Althusser at a very deep level by saying that ain't how it works, brother. And the more that you try to violently impose this sort of like monochronology and this sort of monoculture in order to achieve the objectives of this Western imperialist capitalism, the worse it's going to come back on you in the end, right? All of these, just look at there's the profusion of forms of expression and the way that it's changing people's consciousness, young people's consciousness, relative to Palestine, right? All that sort of, neoliberal fucking nonsense about how to live. It just doesn't make sense to people anymore, right? And they're, young people are drawing on, from the river to the sea. And I mean, even though that's the way that's been treated by these Western governments, it's so despicable and cowardly, but they're pulling on resources, concepts, images, tropes, messages, all that sort of stuff from the past that do not belong, quote unquote, to the present that, the ruling class wants us to stay sequestered within, and using it to break that space that they want us to be sequestered within, right? So there's always this kind of disjointedness to the actual material conditions and the way that the superstructures ramify, and the way that they take their efficacy, and that their efficacy is exercised through our social operations.
That's so good, and tying it to that quote from the 18th Brumaire is a great thing to do. I actually started my paper, that paper I was just talking about, with that quote about how men don't make their own history, but not of their own accord, to kind of get into that entire concept. But you mentioned the Soviet Union, and immediately I started jotting down, a survival of a past era. And, the very existence of this Ukraine proxy war against Russia is premised on the basis of NATO, right, as a thing that must crush the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union itself has died. The threat that NATO was coalesced to confront is no longer there, but the momentum of it is still there. And so even though Russia is a brutally capitalist society, just as brutal as American capitalism in every single way, the survival of not just NATO and U.S. hegemony in that post-war era, but the ideology that it generated is still very much alive in the minds of these 70 and 80-year-old fucking zombie freak fucks who run this world order. And so you can see how that ideology is still so present. It's shaping material reality, even though the material basis that gave rise to that ideology and those forces in the first place and in some ways already have dissipated and evaporated. But they're still trying to shove the square peg of post-war ideology, whether it's neoliberalism at home or Russia must be stopped and brutal imperial hegemony abroad. that ideology lives on, and it's a survival in some sense that is haunting us today.
Yeah, and yeah, so there's a good side and a bad side to it, right? And we are being haunted by the bad side, but we're also being haunted by the good side. And you can see the bad side is working. Like, still out this international rules-based order. Oh, I saw AOC being like, we need to get these funds to Ukraine because it's the best way of defending democracy geopolitically. Like, all of these phrases and words, like, they're just so empty now. I mean, do you find that as well? It's just so empty.
It's so empty. It doesn't resonate with anybody under fucking 40. And that is giving rise to this crisis where the political establishment is desperately trying to squash these campus uprisings because the people in those uprisings have a different ideology. They're informed by different mediums. What we're seeing with the Democrats and Republicans freaking out about campus, right? And they've been doing this for years, but it's really coming to a head right now, is precisely the contradiction of this ideological survival of a time in a totally different context that young people are alien to. They no longer accept the basic premises of that era. They grew up in completely different material context than the people who want to carry forward that ideology still. And this material clash between the police state and the youth and all the contradictions of these fucking idiot asshole freaks in the Democratic Party talking about you have to fucking vote for us if you want to stop fascism and preserve democracy as they are marching out the fascist troops to squash our First Amendment rights to assembly and free speech. It is fucking insane. But that insanity is a product of the fact that this ideology no longer has any tread with real material reality. And so, of course, crisis is the result. And that's what we're saying. And while it's an ugly thing to watch, Palestinians are still being slaughtered and college kids are being brutalized by fucking 45-year-old men in body armor at the behest of the fucking state, that is a transition period that necessarily must occur to rid ourselves of this old ideology, of these survivals that are haunting us. And that is going to take the form of a prolonged crisis abroad. Externally, there's a crisis of empire. Internally, there's a crisis of legitimacy. And those are products of this sort of material dissidence between the superstructural ideology of those in charge and the material reality of people trying to start and build their life in the actual context that they exist. And that is what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. These people out there still seeing this stuff. I mean, it's kind of like you're in a relationship with someone, and there's the first time you say I love you, and then it falls dead and doesn't feel like anything, and then for a while after that you'll still do it, like all this kind of stuff, and then the relationship itself actually ends later. But that's sort of where these people are at right now. It seems like, like this stuff, this. Still like sending at this like triumphalist messaging about NATO and the IMF, like the World Bank and all the like this whole, or when they were like trying to do the Red Sea, like we've got a coalition of 7 nations, and it's like, yeah, Canada sent 2 officers, the Netherlands sent the boat with no staff, no personnel, like this, like, they're still saying the stuff, but the reality doesn't correspond to it. So it's like this deleterious kind of survival. Absolutely. Whereas the survival is being called upon by the protesters in this sort of movement against genocide and ultimately against Western imperialism, they are drawing sort of productively and generatively off these survivals.
Absolutely. Whenever I hear the term rules-based international order, my eyes roll in the back of my head. Vomit begins emerging from my throat. A laugh escapes my lips. It is the most absurd fucking thing in the world. The moment you hear rules-based international order, you know somebody's engaging in ideological mystification, and it's utter bullshit. That should immediately set off all your alarms. Everything that comes after that is pure propaganda, nothing of substance. And the hilarious idea about AOC talking about, re-entrenching this idea that we need to give money to Ukraine because, they're fighting against the authoritarian Russians. Ukraine is, before this war, objectively the most corrupt country in Europe. It is an oligarchic, anti-democratic, corrupt state, just as corrupt in every way as the U.S. and Russia. And to think that you are helping the Ukrainians defend democracy, a democracy they don't even fucking have, neither do the other 2 states involved, is absolutely fucking laughable. But that is the absurdity that comes from trying to, again, enforce this idea whose time and whose material basis has completely passed, but you're still trying to impose the superstructure where the base no longer exists. This is what we get.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've been meaning to make this comment too. I have been thinking, and I think part of why they're leaning so hard into this is they don't want to give up their position, their class position, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But on a deeper level, I've been thinking, probably since around November or December, that the movements that are happening now, what I'm seeing, the changes are bigger, way bigger than the fall of the Soviet Union. I saw this one analyst, Andrei Martyanov. He kind of goes in those circles with some of those more right-wing dudes like Scott Ritter and those guys. Mm-hmm. But he's I find him very on point, and he does speak highly of the Soviet Union from time to time. And he said and he's Russian, and he said that too. He's like, what's happening right now is, and this was like last month or month before, he said that this is bigger than the fall of the Soviet Union. What's happening to the West is bigger than that. And I've certainly felt that since pretty early into the post Al-Aqsa flood, October 7th day. And that's part of why I think they're hanging on so completely, is because they know that, depending on how you periodize it, like between 500 and 2,000 years of brutal, violent Western domination it's coming to an end. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing they can do to stop it. They're begging China. It's like, please, like, don't be free market with us. Like, just all this nonsense they're getting on with. It's just over, and they don't know how to be human beings.
Absolutely.
They don't know how to do it.
The hilarious part of when the Soviet Union collapsed, of course, there was this period of triumphalism in the West, and we get the Francis Fukuyama's The End of History sort of emerging out of this triumphalism that just had this concrete idea that, liberal, democratic, quote unquote, capitalism and Western, quote unquote, values have ultimately triumphed. And now we're moving into this era where those ideas become absolutely hegemonic. But the truth of the matter is not that the U.S. and the West defeated the Soviet Union. It's that the Soviet Union collapsed just a few decades before the West collapsed, right? It's not that one beat the other and then the other one gets to reign for 1,000 years. It's that the entire system, the Soviet Union collapsed for complex internal and external reasons, right? We can get into it, revisionism, all this other stuff. But the U.S.-based order and U.S. liberal capitalism is now also in a state of collapse. So it's not like the U.S. fucking won. It's just that its collapse was a little delayed, was able to be propped up a little longer. And I think with 9/11, we got the first shot across the bow of the end of history. Mm-hmm. And with the 2008 financial crisis, the beginning of the end has officially started. And we are still living in that crisis period generated by all of that late 90s, early 2000s history. And this process is going to continue to play out. And I don't know how much longer we have. Maybe the internal contradictions and the external contradictions will continue to mount for several years. Maybe something happens next month. I'm not exactly sure how this plays out, but that is what's happening. And, there was no victory. It's just a delayed collapse as well. And so I think that's what we're living through.
Oh, like 2008, you said 9/11 was a shot across the bow. 2008 was a torpedo in the hull.
Exactly right.
And now I'll share one of our Newfoundland cultural gems with the listeners. Here, if you got a hull breach, you sprung a leak, we got a saying here for that. And it's the arse has gone right out of it. So
beautiful.
Like when COVID came and everyone, we had to do the lockdown and everything. I came on to like the message board, like Reddit, and see what people are saying. And people had this meme where it's like, we need to restore the arse. Operation Restore Arse.
That's, by all means.
Yeah, but in this case, with Western imperialism, the arse shall not be restored. The arse has gone right out of her. That's
exactly
it.
Right.
So, anyway.
We love it,
Next
folks.
question.
We love it. All right. Number 7. Let's return to the notion that dialectical change is fundamentally characterized by unevenness. Althusser calls it a primary, not secondary, law of the dialectic. What does he mean by this, and how can we wrap our heads around it? How does it help keep dialectics tied to the sciences? What is the connection between unevenness and the transformation of quantity into quality?
It's been like 4 months now since I devised this question for us to discuss. Mm-hmm. So I've got to remember exactly what I was thinking. We can just follow on the last question that we just went over and see the unevenness there, right? So like when you're in a new set of material circumstances, the superstructural aspects don't just catch up right away. There's always there's that kind of unevenness, but then there's also the unevenness of the material dialectic of factors and events and everything piling up to the point where you get to the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back, and then all of a sudden you're in a different world, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, look at what just happened with Operation True Promise that Iran did on Israel, and really, I think, slapped the bejesus out of them. Gave them a real fright. It's that, you had these, 20 years of this war on terror crap, and the United States projecting this apparent omnipotence, like, that they can just absolutely control everything, destroy anything that's falling out of their control, and make sure that they permanently stay on top, while they're slowly, neoliberalizing their military, slowly moving away from, traditional combined arms, military forces and operations. Someone in the army that are like Andrei Martynov, he could talk about this way better than I could, but just slowly, altering their military formation so that it's more just like urban combat with small squads, and they're just like putting down insurgents and all this kind of, which is to say, liberation fighters. But then they run into this incident with Iran, and then it becomes more and more clear, like, exactly how weakened they've become, right? And so there's this, this sort of like, I think to some extent, a certain kind of like break that happened with the Iran response, where it's like, wow, we really are the next world now. Like, they really can't just do whatever they want to people and like really get away with it anymore the way that they used to be able to. But that is not something that, like, that set of transformations is not something that maps onto the kind of like bad Hegelian sort of dialectical process that Althusser is talking about, where everything comes in its due time and develops up its course, and you kind of anticipate it to a certain extent. What we find is that, we're constantly being smacked by these things that were unforeseen to us, but then when we go and investigate the things that were unforeseen, we can deduce or like adduce their intelligibility, and it's like, oh, that's why this happened. But the relationship that they have to the way that we actually perceive things doesn't operate in that way. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah.
This is stuff I find very tough.
Yeah, it is tough for sure. One thing I was writing down when you were speaking is that they're in a, kind of thinking about, you're talking about Iran and, Hamas and all this, obviously the conflict going on right now. And one of the things that I've noticed that has changed even since 9/11, especially since 9/11, is the inability of the ruling class to convince their own people of their cause via ideological mystification. And there's lots of reasons for that, in part the communicative technologies, which allows us to get around corporate media, the material conditions that young people have grown up in. Young people right now, if you're on those campus protests, you're 19, 20, 21 years old. You were like 14, 15, 16 during 2020. You were like 5 or 6 during Occupy. You've come up in like a totally sort of different material context, and then you have access to brand new modes of information, like a show like this, a conversation like this. 20 years ago would just happen in a bar between me and Matt. It would not be programmed out to thousands, tens of thousands of other human beings. And so there's lots of these things that have shifted. But if you remember, after 9/11, the U.S. ruling class was absolutely able, and there's a lot of like, in hindsight, a lot of people saying like all these critiques of the Iraq war and everything. At the time, for a good span of 5 to 10 fucking years, the American people were ideologically mystified into believe that this was a fight about freedom and democracy, that, Islam is this inherently violent and primeval religion. Thanks, New Atheists, for that ideological contribution. And most people believed it. Most people across the political spectrum imbibed that propaganda, internalized it, and externalized it in the form of their beliefs and their politics and who they vote for and what politicians say, etc. And think about how, Arabs and Muslims were able to so easily be utterly demonized after 9/11, and how impossible it seems, especially among young people, for the ruling class to play that same game today, even though they're trying. Their whole thing, Israel is this innocent, fascists always present themselves as innocent, right? Even as they are the aggressor. They're always saying, actually, we're the real victims. The Nazis did this, racist fascists in the U.S. do this, Zionists do this, where they're simultaneously, a victim of these evil Muslims, but also the most brutal, asshole, violent enforcers of just complete mass murder on people. You can kind of see that. But out of the 9/11 era came a lot of this idea that like Americans are fucking ignorant. Like the whole rest of the world was much more informed on what was happening, and Americans were so ideologically mystified that everything they said was fucking ignorant because they were echoing in so many ways the ideological narrative being given to them by the ruling class elite, and that no longer works. That no longer works. And you can see that the ruling class is coming to terms with the fact that no longer works via the brutality that they need to impose. But here's the funny thing about dialectics as well. The more you try to repress something, the more you inflame it. That's true emotionally. Like if you have issues, like even using the terms of psychoanalysis, like Jungian psychoanalysis, like you have a shadow side, and if you repress it, that shadow side comes out in all these neurotic and unhealthy and self-sabotaging ways. And only by actually addressing it and looking at it, reflecting on it, and integrating it, does that shadow become no longer sort of harmful. But what we see here is this desperate attempt to clamp down on the protest, and in that very act of clamping down, it spreads the wildfire. It pours gasoline on the fire. And I think that shows the incompetence of the ruling class elite and really foreshadows this whole era is coming to an end, because all we see is it growing. And not only do we see it growing over more campuses in North America, we now see it expanding to campuses all over the fucking world, including in Europe and including in West Asia. And the more videos there are of fucking big burly piece of shit cops slamming fucking 50-year-old professors onto the ground and brutalizing fucking 19-year-old students, the more people around the world pick up the Palestinian flag and go out on their campus and start to occupy it. So it's really this fascinating fucking thing that we're watching. But their ability to convince us of their narratives is completely being destroyed. And that's why they want to ban TikTok. And that's why they want to crack down on campuses. And that's why they want to demonize the youth, is because they know on some level, even if it's not fully conscious, they are losing their fucking grip, and their time in power and their ideas are coming to an end.
Yeah. And it's happening faster every day. It's certainly happening faster than I even anticipated. That's for sure. And there's nothing you can do to slow it down at this point, I don't think, other than just killing everyone. Yeah. Which, let's not rule. I mean, they a lot. I think Joe Biden would love to slaughter way more people.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But I wanted to touch on that sub question. So, how does this concept of evenness help keep dialectics tied to the sciences? And again, like science, I'm struggling through it, and I will continue for the rest of my life to get better at this stuff. But the sciences really don't deal with like equilibrium states so much as they do with like one state tending towards another state, right? This is what calculus is about. This is what so much of just so much of mathematics is about. It's about the transformation of one thing into another. And that means like things not staying in an equilibrium. Things are always tending toward the next thing. They're moving away from what was before. And in sort of like bourgeois ideology, everything is sort of in a kind of like false stillness. They don't accept that, or it doesn't accept, or it doesn't want you to accept that everything is slowly transformed. Even though you can't perceive it, everything to some extent is transforming into something else. And the qualitative transformation will succeed or come at the end of a series of quantitative transformations. So quantity and quality are in a sort of condition of unevenness relative to each other as well. And that's what I think it's, mathematics, I think for anyone interested in dialectical materialism, mathematics is an extremely important thing to learn, I would argue. I have found some forms of it that, again, like I struggle with math my whole life. I'm one of those people. It's like, I suck at math. And everyone's like, no, you don't suck. You just had the wrong condition, like all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. I sucked at math. But I found, because we really just had like a colonial curriculum to be, shopkeepers or fishermen or something like that. There's a survival, even though that wasn't realistic for the material conditions we were going to go into with the rise of neoliberalism and then NAFTA and all that stuff. They were still training us to approach learning as though it was like 1910 in a way, right? So we started out just arithmetic and then moved into algebra, and that's when I found it. I've never recovered through all of high school, but later in my 20s, I started reading set theory, and that, slowly over many years, I've gotten a better grasp of things. But then in the last year or two, I discovered category theory, and I found that stuff is very, very helpful. And just, learning more about the calculus, learning more about topology and like transformations. And again, like I'm the opposite of an expert, so I'm probably saying ignorant things here or getting things a little bit wrong. But I'm not wrong about the fact that mathematics can only bolster your skill as a dialectician and as a dialectical materialist, and its relation to the sciences as well. And, like Trotsky says that chemistry is like the ultimate science of dialectical materialism. So it's helpful for us to learn physics, biology, and chemistry from the standpoint of dialectical materialism and to consider the unevenness of processes.
Absolutely, which is why I'm notorious for using evolution via natural selection as a teaching tool to explain to people dialectical materialism, that the cosmos actually works this way, and you can apprehend it better, whether it's chemistry, biology, physics, by apprehending it through the dialectical lens, which is absolutely fucking beautiful and deepens your understanding of the cosmos. And if we are the universe experiencing itself and becoming conscious of itself, to understand itself at deeper and deeper levels is, in some sense, the goal of all of this. And so, dialectics helps in that regard.
And so, if I can characterize the unevenness thing one last way,
yes,
it's not the case that you have one state of affairs or one object, and then instantaneously, boom, it's replaced with another one, completely replaces it, and completely exerts its own presence. In reality, and the more we look at the sciences and mathematics and consider dialectics and praxis and societies, we see that it's not that way at all. Things are coming into being, forming as sort of what they are, with antecedents that themselves came into being and then tended away from their own being towards other things through death or dissolution or reproduction or whatever it is. And then whatever is here now is already in the process of dialectically giving way to what will appear to you next.
Absolutely. And the last thing I'll say about this is you can think about this unevenness and this transformation, the dialectical change is being characterized by unevenness. You can look at the shift from feudalism into capitalism. I always bring this point up. It was not merely this like, okay, once things had reached a certain point, boom, now you have capitalism and feudalism has ended. No, it is this, this uneven development, right? Some countries advance faster than others, and then those countries that advance faster then turn around and exploit those who, are making this change at an uneven and slower rate. You see false starts, you see repressions, you see the French Revolution, and then you see Napoleon. This is how dialectics actually fucking works. And so if we understand that's that 500 plus year transition from feudalism through mercantilism through revolutions and reactions to modern day monopoly capitalism, then we can also understand immediately that the shift to socialism will also be similar. That it is going to be these jumps and these starts, these fallbacks, these retreats, these reactions. And so, of course, the Soviet Union could not be perfect socialism, nor could it never end. It had to sort of take two steps forward, make incredible advancements theoretically and materially, and then dissolve away and fall away to be replaced by other movements trying their heart. Then you have China rising up, trying socialism in the Chinese context. And then you have the Deng reforms, and like, let's see if we can do it a little different. Let's see if we can integrate into the global economy strategically, And so this is the nature of dialectical change. And that's what we have seen historically and will continue to see. And I think it really helps people sort of schematically, tactically, and strategically to understand that the fight for socialism will be like the transformations of previous times from other mode of productions into others. It's never clean. It's never done on the first try. It's never perfect. And it's and it's still to this day we have feudal arrangements. There are elements of the global order that still are feudal or semi-feudal in their character. We have slavery in the modern world. We have slavery even in the most advanced industrial, post-industrial capitalist society on earth, America. We have slavery in the prison systems. And so these older modes of productions also don't fully go away. They linger. They haunt us, right? They survive in these various ways under class society. And perhaps we can get out of that only when we get out of class society. So, socialism is this attempt to move from capitalism, a class society, into communism, a classless society. And so maybe socialism itself and the process, the global process that takes place under this however long it takes movement into socialism, will also have these elements as well. They'll be maybe brought to higher levels, or they'll be expressed differently. Maybe slavery will fall away, but there are still semi-feudal society. Who knows? But I think we should really think in that complicated and nuanced way so that we don't fall into this trap of hyper-simplistic, stagist dogmatism, right?
Yes, exactly.
All right, so number 8 is, what can we draw from our discussion so far about the relationship between historical and non-historical objects or processes?
Yeah, so the interesting things about what Althusser says in the appendix when he's critiquing Engels is that the superstructural effects, that is to say, how they actually operate in us, on us, and through us, they are all arguably intelligible in some sense, like Marshall McLuhan can make them intelligible, right, this, that, or the other way, or some other media critique type person, or not in the vulgar sense of media critique, but in the more higher, like, philosophical sense that McLuhan does. But the question is, what of those effects is intelligible historically in the sense of in the life of the class struggle? And so Althusser is saying we need to have the right techniques to make those superstructural effects intelligible from the standpoint of this problem that we have of history. But nonetheless, those ones are still not categorically different than the ones that do not get taken up in the historical intelligibility. So there's this kind of like porous border between the historical and the non-historical that I think is ripe for exploitation, not in the capitalist sense. And I actually just want to bring Foucault one last time and read from what I think is the most influential on me thing that he wrote. I would say most people listening have never heard of. And it's an essay called Return to History. Have you ever heard of this?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
It's from 1972, so like the same year that he defended Marxism against Noam Chomsky.
Sounds familiar, but I don't know.
So he basically, in this essay and an interview from it's either the same year or the year before, called On the Ways of Writing History, he lays out this sort of epistemological duality that he posits of what he calls a series and what he calls an event. Now, this brings us right back to the beginning of the episode, where I talked about how practice forces us into adopting state concepts and continuum concepts. And he says that everything in history can be looked at from the standpoint of event, which is to say a state, right? Mm-hmm. Structure without change and transformation, or rather structure emphasized over change and transformation, mm-hmm. or from the standpoint of series, which is to say transformation emphasized out front of or over structure. And every historical object can be looked at and is, in fact, both of these things at once.
Yes.
And he says, I would now like to show how certain methods currently employed by historians make it possible to give a new meaning to the notion of event. Now, here he's, I think, sort of critiquing a very well-known school of historians in France called the Annales School. And the most famous one of them is Ferdinand Braudel. And you'll probably encounter Braudel if you haven't already in your historical studies in school. And what Braudel does, a very influential historian and a very influential historical approach, is that he says there's basically three kinds of historical time. There's what he calls long duration, in French, longue durée. That's like, thousands and thousands and thousands of years. There's long duration time. And then there's a sort of like intermediary time of, 50 to 200 years, certain social trends, changes and stuff like that. And then you have what he calls event time. And he's like, an event is just something that happens in a very short period of time, like an assassination or something like that, or a bridge collapsing, screwing up Baltimore, right? Or something like that. But Foucault has a very different concept of event. And his definition of an event is two material, chronological, historical series intersecting with one another. Right? And it's sort of not that entirely dissimilar to what Engels says about the parallelogram of forces, right? So it's on one level, two forces colliding and creating a third thing, which is the resultant of the collision of those two forces. But what Foucault, following Althusser, writes into this is that we cannot lose sight of the fact that the two series are themselves composed of events which are themselves composed of series. And so you see this kind of like, you can see generation and change written into and perceivable within moments of stability. This is why Althusser and Etienne Balibar praise Foucault so highly in their book Reading Capital from 1965, because they're like, yeah, he's got these techniques for perceiving not only that structures are transformations, but also at the same time that transformations have structures. And this is, and I'm just going to, I've used the word flux a number of times in the deep dive, and I hate the term flux for the same reason Foucault likes it. He's like, it's too romantic and just hand wavy. We need to be able to show that even changes have structures, and differences have structures. Anyway, so continuing. People are in the habit of saying that contemporary history concerns itself less and less with events and more with certain broad general phenomena that would extend through time, as it were, and would remain immobile through time. But for several decades, historians have been practicing a so-called serial history, in which events and sets of events constitute the central theme. Serial history does not focus on general objects that have been constituted beforehand, such as feudalism or industrial development. Serial history defines its object on the basis of an ensemble of documents at its disposal. Thus, about 10 years ago, a study was done of the commercial archive of the port of Seville during the 16th century. Everything having to do with the entry and exit of ships, their number, their cargoes, the selling price of their goods, their nationality, the places they came from, the places they were sailing to. It was all these data, but only these data, that constituted the object of study. In other words, the object of history is no longer given by a kind of prior categorization into periods, epochs, nations, continents, forms of culture. One no longer studies Spain and America during the Renaissance. One studies, and that is the sole object, all the documents relating to the life of the port of Seville at such and such a date. This consequence, the consequence, and this is the second trait of the serial history, is that this history doesn't use these documents to immediately decipher the economic development of Spain. The object of historical research is to establish, on the basis of these documents, a certain number of relations. In this way, it was possible to establish, I'm referring again to Huguet and Pierre Chaunoux's study on Seville, year-by-year statistical estimates of the entries and exits of ships, classifications according to countries, and distributions in terms of goods. Based on the relations they were able to establish, the Chaunouxs were able also to plot the curves of development, the fluctuations, the increases, the stoppages, the decreases. They could describe cycles and establish relations, finally, between this group of documents concerning the port of Seville and other documents of the same type concerning the ports of South America, the Antilles, England, and the Mediterranean ports. The historian, you see, does not interpret the document in order to reach behind it and grasp a kind of hidden social or spiritual reality. His work consists in manipulating and processing a series of homogeneous documents relating to a particular object and a particular epoch, and the internal or external relations of this corpus of documents are what constitute the outcome of the historian's work. Using this method, and this is the third feature of serial history, the historian can reveal events that would not have appeared in any other way. In traditional history, it was thought that events were what was known, what was visible, what was directly or indirectly identifiable, and the work of the historian was to search for their cause or meaning. The cause or meaning was essentially hidden. The event, on the other hand, was essentially visible, even if one sometimes lacked the documents to establish it with certainty. Serial history makes it possible to bring out different layers of events, as it were, some being visible, even immediately knowable by the contemporaries. Comment by this, he means the people who are contemporary to these events. Continuing, and then beneath these events that form the froth of history, so to speak, there are other events that are invisible, imperceptible for the contemporaries, and are of a completely different form. Let's take up the example of the Chaunoux's work again. In a sense, the entry or exit of a ship from the port of Seville is an event with which the contemporaries inhabiting Seville were perfectly familiar, and which we can reconstruct without too many problems. Beneath this layer of events, there exists another type of events that are a bit more diffuse, events that are not perceived exactly in the same way by the contemporaries, but which they have a certain awareness of all the same, For example, a lowering or an increase of prices which will change their economic behavior. And then, beneath these events as well, you have others that are hard to locate, that are often barely perceptible for the contemporaries, but nonetheless constitute decisive breaks. Thus, the reversal of a trend, the point at which an economic curve that had been increasing levels off or begins to decline. Such a point is a very important event in the history of a town, a country, or possibly a civilization, but the people who are its contemporaries are not aware of it. In our own case, despite a relatively precise national accountancy, we don't exactly know that the reversal of an economic trend has occurred. The economists themselves don't know whether a stop in an economic curve signals a great general economic reversal of the trend, or simply a stop, or a little intercycle within a more general cycle. It is history's task to uncover this hidden layer of diffuse, quote-unquote, atmospheric, polycephalic events that determine, finally and profoundly, the history of the world. For it is quite clear to us now that the reversal of an economic trend is much more important than the death of a king, end quote. And what I find interesting, and hopping from Althusser into Foucault here, is that the sort of schema of analysis that Althusser sets up and that Foucault here continues enables you to shift seamlessly from non-historical to historical events. Because let's just go back to, thus about 10 years ago, a study was done of the commercial archive of the Port of Seville during the 16th century. Everything having to do with the entry and exit of ships, their number, their cargoes, their selling price of their goods, their nationality, the places they came from, the places they were sailing to. And so you can move from that level of analysis up to considering the historical import, their historical import, but it also opens you up to a whole reality of non-historical events or non-historical happenings that help contribute to historical happenings. Like this ship was delayed. This ship was delayed because one of the guys went on shore leave while we were in port, and he caught a communicable disease, like a respiratory disease, and everyone got sick for a week, and we were delayed from leaving. And so there's these things in and of themselves are resolutely non-historical. And if there's one instance of it, even the whole ship being delayed for a week or something like that is non-historical. But if you have a pandemic, for example, that shuts down global shipping, which is really nothing other than a whole concatenation of little events like that, that is historical. And so again, against all these amateurs out there that call Michel Foucault a postmodernist or a post-structuralist, here is a man who is a thinker, doesn't matter that he's a man, a thinker who's a responsible materialist, who is showing that you can actually segue from the non-historical into the historical and back by using these methods. Yeah. This is why I hate Western academia.
That's very good. Fascinating stuff, man. Fascinating stuff.
But that's the thing. So I think that, history and non-history are opposed as opposites, but here you can find their unity and then actually navigate through them.
Absolutely. Beautiful. All right. Well, to wrap this conversation up, what are some takeaways for us here considering present-day debates among the Western left, such as it is, like those of settler colonialism, the national question, or sectarianism? What can we learn?
To temper our expectations is probably the most immediate practical takeaway that we can have, because how often do you go on social media, or I'll pop onto Reddit or, whatever, and something happens and people are caught in the immediacy of it, right? So, there's, we've talked about this before. There is a pervasive doomerism among Westerners, a pervasive, fatalistic, pessimistic that you see. It's like, no faith in humanity, or just like, I've seen this before. I look at what Israel is doing to Gaza, and I realize humanity is disease, and we all humanity needs to go. And it's like, you're saying that you want the Palestinians to die, you fool.
I know, yeah.
Right? But part of it is just we get presented with these specters, these images of what is happening, but they are not, the immediacy and the sort of apparent permanence of them is not in keeping with the processes that delivered those appearances to you in the first place. And so the kind of quasi-mathematical way that Althusser takes up of considering events, and that I just, supplemented with a bit of Foucault there, I think it can hopefully help us develop just more realistic expectations and not panic all the time, not take the first datum that appears to you as the whole answer and all that kind of stuff. And then also expect the unexpected. Right. Again, to go back to, we talked about settler colonialism last time, and the way that some Western Marxists think, well, this scotches the conceptual scheme of bourgeoisie and proletariat and the whole system of categories and inferences that go along with that. Mm-hmm. And it's but the world isn't responsible to that scheme. That scheme is responsible to the world.
Exactly.
This is why Mao says it's not a religion, it's a guide to action, right? Or to take off someone from the past. Even, Thomas Aquinas says, if you are reading the Bible and then you go out and you explore nature, and nature appears to contradict the Bible, then you're reading the Bible wrong. It's not that nature is wrong. Because if that's true, then there's no reason for science. And as Aquinas works out in the very first passages of the Summa Theologica, we need science. And what science tells us should modify our reading of the scripture. Now, if Thomas Aquinas, who is he's the golden boy of Roman Catholicism can make that concession, then certainly Marxists can make that concession.
Absolutely.
That is that the scripture is accountable to reality and not the other way around. And that's what makes it scientific socialism. Yeah, I think that's the takeaway. And Althusser, it's the Schrodinger's name pronunciation, whatever. It's neither. It's both until you actually say it. What he's giving you a means to sort of rationally take that on board and incorporate it into your being and the way that you conduct yourself, whether you're trying to communicate about this stuff to people or engage in, some kind of organizing, but trying to change, or, trying to bring people over to our side, those who are ready to have their minds changed, to give them the best possible account of what it is to be on our side. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Beautifully said. Beautifully said.
I don't know what for you. I'm sorry to interrupt you as you're praising me. Love when you say beautifully said. I don't know. What about you for takeaways?
No, I really like that. I love that point that you made, that, we're supposed to orient ourselves towards reality. We can't shift reality to orient themselves towards our dogmas. And in the case of settler colonialism and the people who want to act like that is all in the past. It has no relevance for today. It's just convenient for their schema. It's convenient for the schema of them as the, gritty proletariat who's fighting the bourgeoisie, and this settler colonial situation. Well, that's sort of that's a wrinkle, that's a complication that I'd rather not deal with. So let me, invent a reason why it's actually in the past and we don't have to worry about it anymore, because that's much nicer for me and my outlook on the world. And it fits much more neatly into my dogmatic perspective of what this tradition that I am identifying with, should say, or what I want it to say. And I think that's a beautiful buttress against all forms of dogmatism and chauvinism. If you can actually sort of reorient your perspective in that regard and understand that the scientific part of scientific socialism is dealing with reality as it actually is, not trying to obscure, mystify, or hide inconvenient parts of reality, but to take the whole thing on. And if anything needs updated, it's not reality, it's your schema. And that's always a very important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, and again, like I said last time, this raft of techniques that we now identify as settler colonialism, by the time proletarianization happened in Europe, it was antecedent or prologue to that proletarianization. But it's also the case that was repurposed so the West could do what it's done in the Americas. I'm sorry it's not easy. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry it doesn't fit into a smoothly operating philosophical scheme. But that's actually what happened. What do you want me to say? You know what I mean?
Exactly.
We need to deal with it. Sorry.
Nature doesn't need to be updated. Your Bible does.
Yeah. Very simple. Yeah.
All right, my friend, another great Dialectics Deep Dive. We obviously have much more to do together. We're certainly not ending our cooperation or our episodes together. We're just sort of putting an end to this 3 years long Dialectic Deep Dive series, which I'm very proud of. Elements of our audience and really, really love. For some people, it's their favorite thing that we do on this show. And I obviously could not do any of this without you and your extensive knowledge, my friend. Before I let you go, is there any recommendations you want to give? Any plugs you want to give? Any last words? Anything at all?
Yeah, I have a list of recommendations. So when I did the AMA with you back in, was that March or February or whatever, I recommended, and instead I would recommend again, the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research's new study, Hyper-Imperialism, A Dangerous Decadent New Stage. And also that one, it's 186 pages long, but it has like a 50-page long executive summary called The Churning of the Global Order. I think, I've seen sort of some anxiety about the term hyper-imperialism, just like with Michael Hudson's super-imperialism, because I think people are afraid that what they're doing is sort of what like Yanis Varoufakis is doing. He's like, we've left capitalism behind. We're in techno-feudalism. And it's like, bro, I don't know about you, but I work for a wage. I don't know where you're at, but anyway.
Yeah.
But that's not what Hudson... or Vijay Prashad are doing with these terms. They really are just trying to analyze sort of inflections of imperialism, like how it's acting depending on where it is at the point that the analysis is made. And the Tricontinental Institute's report on hyper-imperialism is extremely valuable. I think it's like if you read Imperialism by Lenin, Neocolonialism by Nkrumah, Super-imperialism by Hudson, which is in a way he's analyzing the development of the superstructural instruments that were used to affect neocolonialism as Nkrumah describes it politically, economically. And then this new study, you'll have a very powerful understanding of what's happening in the world right now. And just to even make it a little bit more palatable, also, Ronnie Akalek did an interview with Vijay Prashad last month called Hyper-Imperialism, U.S. NATO's Dangerous and Decadent New Stage. So I'll give you the links for the show notes. Okay. I also want to recommend a book that some of my comrades alerted me to. So this is a translation of the Vietnamese government's sort of mandatory first-year university text on Marxism-Leninism. Have you heard about this one yet?
No, I don't think so.
And it was translated by someone named Luna Wing. I'm terrible at this. When I was a kid, I thought it was pronounced Nagoyan, and then I was like, no, it's Nguyen, and now I've heard it's Wing, so I apologize. I also apologize because until I found out about this book, I thought this person was a gaming streamer. I deeply apologize for that.
Yeah.
But the text is called The Curriculum of the Basic Principles of Marxism-Leninism, Part 1, The Worldview and Philosophical Methodology of Marxism-Leninism. And Luna, I'm just going to call her by her internet name, Luna Oy, because I'm going to embarrass myself again. She translated it and annotated it, so gave philosophical, conceptual, historical commentary on the text all the way throughout. There's some stuff in there I would debate with her over, like her use of the thesis antithesis synthesis scheme. But I think this is an excellent piece of work for anyone. So like my best buddy here, finally at age 44, it's like, fuck it, I'm done. I'm going to learn Lenin. I'm going to learn all of it. None of this other shit works. It doesn't make sense. What you've told me makes sense. Give it to me. And I was like, check this book out because this is accessible to people, just coming out of high school. I saw a commenter on Patreon say that they're a high school dropout and our episodes have been helpful to them. That's exactly the kind of person I want to reach. I'm not interested in reaching people like perfectly formed inside an academic laboratory or something like that.
Yeah.
I want to reach real people, and I think that this text is good for helping real people. And it's available for free in PDF. You can order a hard copy too, but it's available for free in PDF, just like the Tricontinental Institute's report and the executive summary are available for free. So I'll put a link for that in the show notes. And thank you to Comrade Luna for doing that work. It's a lot of work.
I do have to say, back in 2021, on Guerrilla History, we had on Luna to discuss the Battle of Dien Bien Phu.
Okay.
People are interested in that. There's a precedent. We interviewed her on Guerrilla History, so go check that out.
Cool. I had missed that one, so I'm going to go listen to that. An interview that Electronic Intifada did with Matteo Capasso a week or two ago, I think, called How Zionism Pushes Liberalism into Decay. And like, I just, again, want to highlight that this guy is an analytical Marxist powerhouse, and I have so much respect for this dude. I would love to meet this guy someday and talk with him. He's both analytically powerful and obviously extremely compassionate and caring, which I think is very important. And the Western Marxism needs to get its act together with that combination, I would say. Another interview from last month, Israel's Descent into Madness and the Holocaust Comparison. Rani Akalik interviewing the historian Tarek Cyril Amar, which is very good. This is just out of interest. Really interesting article I read in Monthly Review by Jun Shu called Industrial Agriculture, Lessons from North Korea. So there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. And two pieces from an outlet called Red Clarion, which is produced by a group called Unity Struggle Unity, which is, I think, more up around like New England. Have you heard of this crew before?
Yeah, I've heard of them.
Okay, so two articles by Comrade Katzfoter, who's one of the editors. The first one is called The Cult Building Tendency, and it's rather long. The second half is like a personal testimony about somebody's bad experience with an org, but it's just like a really good look into some of the things you should be keeping an eye out for if like you've gotten into a bad organization where there's like abusive behavior happening and stuff like that, because we know that that's sort of been a hallmark of Western parties for a long time. So that's, I think, young people out there that are trying to find their way into different orgs, give that a read. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And again, whatever judgment, people are making about this or that organization in giving their testimonies, maybe you see something that makes you want, I don't feel that way about this group or that group, that's whatever. But the opening analysis, I think, is very, very helpful, regardless of how you feel about any organization that's named.
Cool.
And then the last one, also by Comrade Katzfoter, is called Undead Unionism, and sort of how unionism in the West got into the situation that it's in and what it needs to do to get out of it. Because without a strong labor movement, the parties are not going to be revitalized and actually get to be able to do anything. We need to build that base layer up. And I might have more to say about that on a subsequent episode.
All right. Well, that's a great list of recommendations. I'll put all of those in the show notes for people to go follow up on. And thank you again, Matthew. This has been a wonderful, fascinating episode as always. And we'll do it again soon.
Yeah, for sure. And so we're going to take a break. I need to take a break for a while because I've been in basically continuous preparation for 3 years for the deep dives. So maybe like the new year, early in the spring or something.
Okay.
So I'm going to get down and do my research on Marxist dissertation and get into that John Bellamy Foster. And then we'll come back with a new series about Marx and eco-socialism and ecology.
Oh yeah, stay tuned for that, my friends. All right, brother. Talk to you soon.
Love and solidarity.
Yo, picture perfect. I paint a perfect picture, even though the words are worthless to a missile when it hits you, or the bullet when it rip you, while the shooter screaming nigga. Does it really make a difference if they black or worship Hitler, Mr. Officer? No one understands just why you shot the ball. He ain't even do like nothing wrong, so why you stop him for? Who got the cure for all of this? Shit's a raw deal. These right-wing freaks gonna get us all killed. Y'all chill. I ain't got time or the patience to try and debate shit with liars and racists. I got one voice, homie, why would I waste it? For motherfuckers who think they life is the Matrix. It's stressful, no one is safe. They'll turn you into fucking death stroke. Chrome to your face, think you did it cause they said so. Throwing they weight, can't even go out grocery shopping cause some cracker come and blow you away. I wouldn't know to explain what a river to the sea means, but I know it's wrong to bomb a kid to smithereens. B, if you on that dumb shit, don't even need to see me. Free Palestine's not hard, shit's easy. Dope knife, Monrovia / DC. Niggas just trying to stay alive like BGs. So I gotta view this shit from a macro level. They wanna make us dig our grave with a plastic shovel. From Sudan to Yemen, Ukraine to Mali. Big men with weapons, we pay for armies. He slayed them, we make the bodies. Keep shit on replay, no team saying sorry. Now look up in the air, it's a plane carrying pain with a payload of bombs that's American made. Committing genocide there in your name, sharing the flame. The world's whack, everyone's gone weird and insane. Fucking out.